The Human Rights Commission was really founded for a couple of different reasons. One was to address discrimination during the 60s, and they were hoping that the civil unrest that was happening around the country with regards to Black people and the civil rights movement wouldn't happen here in San Francisco, so they created it. And then over the years, the mandate in the charter has been really focused on preventing discrimination or addressing it. And these folks really manage, and there's Jude in the back. Jude is also part of the team. This team has been really working in the shadows doing this work. They don't get a lot of limelight and attention and celebration, but they do the heavy lift. There's Nina, who's also part of the team. And so I just am really grateful for this team, because they have continued the mandate of the office. They are the folks that day in, day out are dealing with folks who are at the worst point in time in their life often, and often are very frustrated with the process and have those hard conversations with these folks, and they keep coming, they keep working, and even when they can't help, they find a way to refer them and connect them with folks. So I just wanted to publicly thank them for their work and their service. Thank you. And today is really something, I know that Stevon will say more about the evolution and the development of this work, but they have been really trying to do more to connect with community and with the partners that are leading this. And thank you for being a part of this first entree into sharing the work that they do, but also working to change the policies and inform folks about how to improve outcomes. So thank you so much, Stevon, for your work and your leadership.
Thank you, Director Davis. It's a beautiful morning in Bayview.
Yeah.
And I was up early today, like a little before 4, getting ready for all of you, and I still didn't know what I was going to say. My grandma's been having some health struggles, but if I was talking to her, she would say, talk for about 2 minutes. That's supposed to be a joke, don't talk too long. And it's always a good time to tell the truth.
Good.
So the truth is, when we started this conversation about putting this day together, I was really skeptical that people wanted to participate in another one of these, where we came together for a day to talk about the thing, and then after that, then what? But the truth is, we need gathering spaces like this to remind ourselves to connect with one another, to continue to build and learn, because problems like this need people's careers to be committed to. This isn't work for the dabblers or the hackers or the people that are interested in quick outcomes, immediate results, get rich quick, lose 10 pounds in 3 days. This isn't this type of work. So we made a call to eradicate the discrimination in our housing. We knew the right people would show up because they were committed to doing the same work. So thank you all for showing up today to be a part of that commitment. We have an incredible lineup of people who are also, like you, aligned with that career journey. The first person, keep it to my grandmother's 2-minute remarks. The first person, I'm going to wrap up. The first person who I have coming up today is a native of the Bay from East Oakland. She made sure I put the East on the Oakland. You don't know how important that is. Dr. Brandon T. Summers has been doing work connected to this field all over the country. She's one of the leading thought leaders in this space, and we're really privileged to have her here right before she leaves us again to go to Columbia University. She was just most recently at UC Berkeley. Is going to start at Columbia University in the fall. So, Dr. Summers.
Columbia University, it's hard to leave home again, but you got to go with opportunities that really feed your soul and your family. So that's what I'm doing. And also, it's just great to get back into Black Studies, where I can actually focus on Black people, but using different tools. And so the work I've been doing, it's like, I'm not a housing scholar. I just found myself in it because I care about what was happening to Black folks, and it was a space where our health, our vitality, so much is driven by how we're able to live. And so in the United States, at least, that's connected to housing. Now, we have this understanding at the same time that property has become something that's more about monetization rather than actually cultivating home. So I think there are ways we have to keep that in mind when we're discussing property, when we're discussing, again, place units of where people are supposed to live. So I'll get started, and what I'm gonna warn you, I tend to incorporate personal anecdotes, images, ideas, because a lot of the work that I've done, oh, you know what I also need to do is set a timer, because I have a script and then I go off script all the time. Okay, all right. I incorporate a lot of personal anecdotes and images because a lot of the work, I'm the first person in my family to go to college, and what that meant for me was that I needed to be able to connect with my family who may not otherwise read the kinds of books that I'm writing. And so the other component was when I was in academia or when I was going to graduate school especially, and when I have some of my colleagues, so many of them had family members who went to college, went to grad school, and I really didn't understand their perspective or point of view, and they didn't seem to understand mine. So in my understanding, my family wasn't exceptional. We were very much a Bay Area family and very much working class, and I knew that the ordinariness wasn't necessarily going to show up in the history books. So I had to figure out how to integrate my family story with those of, that's happening all around the nation, but certainly in the Bay Area. So it's still important for me to incorporate my family stories, even if my family doesn't quite understand what I do, nor do they sometimes understand how I'm trying to connect. So I'll stop talking and I'll get started. So I wanted to pull up this quote from Floyd Hunter. So this report was written about discrimination in housing in Oakland. But in 1964, the study was able to go over not only just Oakland, but the Bay Area, the San Francisco Bay Area. And so I wanted to pull this quote to get a clear understanding of what it was like, one, back then in the 60s when this commission came about, but also this concept of containment and the ways that Black people have ultimately been contained in different locations, especially in urban areas. So as Yvonne said, I was born on the other side of the bay in Berkeley at Alta Bates Hospital in the 1900s. That's what my child says. She said, "Mommy, you were born in the 1900s." Okay. So my parents, who met while working as cashiers at Safeway in Rockridge, bought our East Oakland home, where I was raised 2 years before. Where I was raised 2 years before I was born. They bought the house. So for the majority of my childhood and beyond, my mom worked for the city of Oakland in various capacities, and my dad spent his entire career as a cashier at Safeway. And he worked in multiple locations in the East Bay mostly. He never came over to this side. So despite my upbringing and current residence in Oakland, I have roots in San Francisco, but more specifically, Hunters Point.
Hey.
My maternal grandparents, the only grandparents I knew, migrated from Louisiana to San Francisco in 1952. They followed my great aunt and uncle, who had moved here previously in search of a stable employment and a better life. They were like so many other Black families who migrated here, who relocated from the Jim Crow South, drawn to pledges of prosperity and equality in the West. This great migration was our own version of the gold rush, one that enticed seekers of gilded promises, of unfettered income mobility, and access to expansive opportunities. So prior to my family's arrival in the early 50s, and really my great aunt came in the late 40s, the Bay Area was one of the fastest growing urban areas. Black and white migrants from the South and the southwestern regions of the US arrived to coastal cities hoping to fulfill the labor needs of a burgeoning wartime industry. Representatives from these industries visited the South, promising higher wages, more stability, racial tolerance, and again, an overall better life in the Bay. The Black population expanded rapidly as the demand for workers in San Francisco, in Richmond, and in Oakland's shipyards grew. More than 50,000 Black migrants came to the Bay Area between 1942 and 1945, hailing mostly from Louisiana, which meant most of us could make gumbo and all the delights of the South. Texas, Arkansas, and Oklahoma. And just on a side note, when I went to college in Philadelphia, again, I'm coming from California. Most of the people from the South in California I knew were from Louisiana or like South Texas. So I assumed we all ate the same food. And I learned that was not true. I didn't know they didn't eat gumbo during their holidays. They thought it was weird. The certain kinds of, I was looking for filet. They didn't know what I was talking about. I had to have my mom ship ingredients from California to me. So there's this way that I got to know the expansiveness of Black culture, but also how special it was growing up here in California. So in 1940, San Francisco's Black population only numbered 4,800. That was less than 1% of the overall population. This is 1940. San Francisco's Black population increased by more than 600% between 1940 and 1945. So by 1945, Black people were the majority of non-white residents in the city. Black migrants were recruited again to work in the shipyards, but particularly to work in the Navy shipyard adjacent to this area. Many of them completed war training in shipbuilding, aircraft repair, and machinery. And this influx of new Black residents with steady and stable jobs helped build the vibrant social and economic community that surrounded the shipyard, surrounded this area, but also in Fillmore. So prior to the influx of Black migrants to SF in 1943, the federal government attempted to address the increasing housing shortage by building 5,500 temporary military barracks around the naval shipyard on Hunters Point Hill. Naval workers and their families lived there, and at that time at least, it was a relatively integrated community. But by 1945, the community's population was at 20,000, and 1/3 of the workers were Black. So Bayview Hunters Point was an area that Black folks could successfully live in. This temporary housing, however, was later turned into public housing, and I'll talk a little bit about that later. So after 1943, Fillmore and Bayview and Hunters Point had San Francisco's largest concentration of Black residents. The Fillmore district became heavily populated by Black migrants after the 1943 eviction and incarceration of Japanese Americans. Black families filled the homes in the Western Addition in particular that were left vacant by interned Japanese Americans. So in 1945, 30,000 Black residents lived in San Francisco. By 1950, the city's Black population grew to over 43,000 people. In the Western Addition, and we know where the Western Addition is. Y'all are most, okay, so I don't have to explain. Okay, good. Because I decided not to show maps, I'm just showing pictures today. In the Western Addition, the population went from 2,144 to 14,888. As a proportion of the district's population, the number jumped from 6% to 34%. That is a staggering jump. Of the census tracts that made up the Fillmore, African Americans made up about 2/3 of the population. Additionally, the Black population may have been undercounted given the high frequency of subdivision of households and housing units. So because of this steep increase in population, the housing question was a particularly contentious one. The overwhelming white residents of San Francisco were not prepared nor excited about their new Black neighbors. Patterns of segregation became more rigid due to housing scarcity. It was during this period, though, that exclusionary housing practices increased, as did the outmigration of white residents. Racial covenants prohibited Black people from purchasing homes in most neighborhoods, except in the Western Addition. So that meant that there were some Black homeowners, specifically in Fillmore. Landlords started to use occupancy clauses and deeds and leases that restricted Black tenants from living in designated parts of the city. Housing discrimination was so bad that it was estimated by UC Berkeley at the time that 80 to 90% of homes in the San Francisco Bay Area were closed to people of color. Suburbanization remade the form, economy, and culture of several metropolitan regions around the country as a whole. Rather than using reductive terms like white flight or urban crisis, we should look at how federal and local policies institutionalize discrimination and difference by allocating resources to mostly white homeowners in suburban municipalities while withdrawing funds from increasingly Black neighborhoods like the Fillmore. What's significant about suburbanization is the gradual accumulation of wealth that white families were able to accrue more readily than Black families. Not just the ways that the federal government, lending institutions, real estate agents, and developers discriminated individually against Black people and Black families, but it's the ways that we have to understand the federal government, the real estate industry, and related institutions, and that includes banks, expressly provided opportunities and capital for white families to have access to immeasurable opportunities like in their school districts, public infrastructure, etc., and also offer various amenities and wealth accumulation while denying Black people any ability to take part in that. It's also important to be clear that white folks didn't just flee the city. They were given several incentives to go there, including low-cost housing. With the government-insured mortgage, for many it was cheaper to buy a house in the suburbs than to rent in San Francisco. So by the 1950s, 90% of Fillmore residents were renting from absentee white and Jewish landlords. So given that history, I wanted to give a context of housing in the US a little bit before World War II when Black people started to come, right? So Franklin, we're familiar with FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt's administration was largely known for and popular for New Deal policies, now as well as bigoted policies like the internment of Japanese Americans. But it explicitly codified racism into the Federal Housing Administration's underwriting manual, which in 1938 said, quote, "It is necessary that property shall continue to be occupied by the same social and racial groups," end quote. So the federal government supported suburbs that prohibited Black residents from buying homes. In fact, the FHA enacted a policy that precluded non-white people from receiving suburban mortgages. The FHA also insured very few loans in central cities, including San Francisco, that most Black people were confined to. And to make matters worse, the FHA also recommended that the suburbs develop restrictive covenants, which forbade Black people and other racialized minorities from buying property. Restrictive covenants were outlawed in 1948, but suburbs like those in Marin County adapted by turning covenants into neighborhood protective associations. It wasn't until the 1968 federal fair housing legislation that this policy and others that enforced the belief that non-white people lower property values and pose a larger investment risk than white people. But the impact ended up being really significant. Less than 1% of new housing built in the US between 1935 and 1952 went to Black people and other people of color. In 1964, only 3% of mortgage loans in the San Francisco Bay Area were government insured. So keep in mind, between 1933 and 1963, the FHA insured $199 billion worth of mortgages, and half of all suburban homes built in the 1950s and 60s across the country had FHA loans. That is a lot of money and a lot of exclusivity for white Americans in particular. Relatedly, city districts, including those in the Bay Area, were classified by the government based on perceived investment risks in terms of real estate, loans, and mortgages. Those neighborhoods that were considered desirable were given an A rating on the corresponding maps were colored green. Those least desirable with a D rating were red. The rankings were determined by building age and conditions, as well as the neighborhood's amenities and infrastructure. But not surprisingly, the most important factor that determined the neighborhood's classification was its racial composition. What this meant is that neighborhoods with large Black populations would get a D ranking, disqualifying residents for government-insured loans. This made it hard for developers to get money to build in these red areas, hence the term redlining. And you can see from the map here, and I'm sure this is, nowadays the redlining maps, the HOLC maps have become really popular. But you can start to see how racialized property values start to come about, and this is from the 1930s. What's also interesting, and if you guys ever go online and take a look at, it's Mapping Inequality project that shows all of the FHA, not only the maps, but also the area description sheets. And those sheets are important because it actually shows the language that local officials, because again, each municipality provided information for these maps, the ways that local officials describe the areas. So I've been knee deep in Oakland's area description sheets, and they'll talk about, or at least they'll have an area for what groups infiltrated or are essentially creating the kind of disease that's coming to the area. So of course, if it was an integrated area, that was typically rated lower. If it was Black, Chinese, and specifically not Asian, Chinese, Mexican, Jewish, it was rated lower. And so in that way, there would be no investment in those areas. So we can take a look at this map, and you could probably map the current conditions in San Francisco that probably match some of these divisions now. Okay, so let's go back to the post-war period. So in late 1947, the San Francisco City Planning Commission proposed a $52 million plan to demolish and redevelop a 36-block area of the Western Addition, where Fillmore is located, surrounded by Van Ness, Webster, McAllister, and Geary Street, which eventually became Geary Boulevard once it was widened. The plan estimated that the new units would house 10,000 people and command rent for $25 to $30 per month, almost reaching the city's median gross rent of $32 a month. Nevertheless, this plan indirectly tried to shut out Black renters because the prices were not affordable to the group. So the San Francisco supervisor was definitely opposed to public housing and insisted instead that the federal government provide additional subsidies to San Francisco to relocate the neighborhood's Black residents to temporary post-war units. So in other words, inferior housing stock. The Bay Area was experiencing a strong economy during and immediately after World War II, but still suffered from a severe housing crisis, with neighborhoods inhabited by Black residents being in the depressed pockets. After the end of the war, the shipyard closed, and Western Addition was officially designated by city officials as a blighted area, designated for redevelopment on June 3rd, 1948 by the Board of Supervisors. That same year, in 1948, the San Francisco Redevelopment Agency was started. It was part of a national effort to achieve post-war urban modernization. But it was the California Community Redevelopment Act of 1945 that ushered in a new wave of municipal development agencies in the state. The act gave cities and counties the authority to establish these agencies to address urban decay and apply for grants and loans from the federal government. Each of these planning arms created master plans for housing, density, traffic management, zoning, and commerce in the designated blighted areas. The agency either purchased, condemned, or enacted eminent domain to accumulate large parcels of land using private investor capital and federal and state funds. And in the aftermath of this, and as you can probably notice, it litters empty lots, right? So it's after they use eminent domain, after urban renewal, you start to see this proliferation of empty lots, whether they turn into parking lots or just fallow land, but they are littered all over the city and in the East Bay. So on the national scale, in his 1949 State of the Union address, President Harry Truman hailed slum clearance as a weapon to combat the nation's post-World War II housing shortage. These two designations of slum clearance and thinking about urban renewal go hand in hand. City leaders and local housing authorities, led primarily by real estate and business professionals, connected temporary war housing in Hunters Point with mostly Black laborers and residents as temporary citizens of San Francisco. The migration of Black Southerners emerged as a way to classify Black people as refugees. City officials and industrial magnates presumed Black migrants would return to the South after the war ended. This logic made way for demolition via slum clearance as the primary method to ensure progress and what James Baldwin famously termed in 1963, Negro removal. And that's a term that's very popular, or at least understood as this historical term, but he was actually in Fillmore when he said urban renewal is Negro removal. So a lot of people didn't realize he was in San Francisco. So for the ways that folks believe that California, even in the 60s, was this progressive beacon, no. And James Baldwin had been all over the world experiencing various forms of discrimination, globally. And he comes here and decides this is Negro removal. All right. So, this was about the time when my family came to settle in San Francisco in the early 50s. As I mentioned, Mama and Papa moved to San Francisco from Louisiana, following in the footsteps of Aunt Willa Mae and Uncle Anderson, who came in the late 40s. They lived on Navy Road, and because as Mama used to tell me, that's the only place where poor Black folks could live. She said Bayview was full of single-family homes, but Hunters Point was the projects, according to my Aunt Barbara. She recalled in a recent conversation, "I remember you could see Navy Road from the window. There was an area called Hilltop where all the stores were. There were a lot of vendors selling vegetables and things. That's where we went to nursery school." Barbara was the first of Mama and Papa's 4 children, and she talked about being a little girl in both Hunters Point and later Fillmore off Golden Gate, where my family moved in 1953. It was in 1953, the year my mom was born, and oh my God, if she was here, she'd be so mad I said that. My mom, the 3rd child. It was that year that the city tore down the first house in the Western Addition as part of one of 2 urban renewal plans. Western Addition 1, which took place in 1953, or I should say started, and then Western Addition A2, which started in 1963. Black residents in the area were unable to challenge renewal plans because they lacked the political and organizational power, and because they were Black, as well as mostly tenants. The Western Addition, with its prime location just west of downtown and a politically weak population, were in the crosshairs of the pro-growth coalition. The Western Addition was eventually developed into one of the largest urban renewal projects in the West. Hundreds of city blocks and tens of thousands of residents were impacted by the destruction. There were multiple strategies that complemented regional and national urban renewal trends by which the city was able to remove Black residents from San Francisco neighborhoods. The Fire Commission, for example, dispatched inspectors to Fillmore buildings who overwhelmingly found multiple code violations, threats to public health and safety, making structures uninhabitable. While tenants mostly agreed that the living conditions in the Fillmore were harsh and perhaps substandard, the city eschewed any responsibility for its negligence in maintaining viable communities for Black residents. Structural forces like urban renewal and other forms of redevelopment throughout the 20th century irrevocably impacted Black life in San Francisco and beyond. The collective impact of redevelopment, racism, poverty, unemployment, and state violence helped shape living conditions in San Francisco. One of the central goals and organizing strategies of slum clearance was, again, public health and safety. Hence the description of the neighborhoods as blighted. Blight is a word that was originally used to describe the botanical process of infecting plants with disease. In most cases, blight spreads by fungal spores carried by insects, wind, water, and animals from infected plants. It's still used in bombing. In planning and real estate, however, blight came to refer to spoiled or damaged places like vacant and dilapidated property, thought to contribute to the spread of social and moral decay. Cities used this logic to surveil and expunge undesirable elements and people from neighborhoods that they hoped to revitalize for capital gain. The increased population density and mixed commercial and residential use was the first evidence of blight that the redevelopment agency cited as justification for the leveling of these neighborhoods. But really, the opposite was just the case. The infamous 1906 earthquake marked the beginning of the neighborhood, I'm talking about Fillmore's, ascension, which would culminate in the period between 1945 and 1965, when the neighborhood, a bustling, thriving cultural center, became one of California's Harlem of the West, alongside West Oakland's 7th Street. The Western Addition at that time was responsible for 1/5 of San Francisco's tuberculosis cases. But that was because garbage accumulated in hallways and backyards, dangerous electrical wiring snaked around residential structures, several single-family units were illegally subdivided into boarding houses with single rooms. My grandfather lived in one of those kinds of rooms once my grandparents divorced in the early 1960s. That was before he was able to buy a house off of Silver Avenue, which is where he lived until he passed away. These dwellings partially satisfied an overwhelming housing shortage in the area. However, they also served as a way for slumlords to extort vulnerable people. Fillmore in particular had an outsized police presence. It had bars, liquor stores, smoke shops, as well as gambling outlets. But the city characterized the neighborhood as a magnet for criminal and immoral activity. Therefore, poverty, disease, indigence, corruption, violence, and irresponsibility came to have a black face in San Francisco. And the Planning Commission moved forward with their plans to clear the neighborhood. The reality for most Fillmore and other Western Addition neighborhoods was that the area wasn't blighted at all. In fact, Fillmore had some of the most stunning and unique architectural structures. What ultimately determined the neighborhood's classification as blighted was the race and class of its inhabitants. Racial tensions all over the country, and San Francisco specifically, were exacerbated by state violence, uprisings, and bombings in the 1960s. And as a result of these interpersonal and structural, as well as institutional practices, the city remained segregated, and Black San Franciscans had limited housing choices. The first phase of the renewal efforts, Project A1, closed in 1973 after opening in 1953. It covered about 16 square blocks and resulted in the widening of Geary Boulevard, as I mentioned earlier, and the construction of Japan Center and eventually a number of housing developments. Nearly the entire Western Addition, almost 70 blocks, was placed under the authority of the San Francisco Redevelopment Agency. One note though, Western Addition A2 was finally sunset in 2009 with an apology from the then mayor about how long it took, blah, blah, blah. Community advocates successfully sued the San Francisco Redevelopment Agency though, and temporarily stopped 2 redevelopment projects that destroyed thousands of low-income housing units, displaced families, and destroyed neighborhoods and communities in the name of blight removal. The first lawsuit was filed against the Redevelopment Agency and HUD by the Western Addition Community Organization, or WACO. WACO came about after SFRA, San Francisco Redevelopment Agency, displaced about 1,350 families due to the A1 plan. WACO demanded that community participation was necessary in the redevelopment process and replacement housing and financial assistance for the displaced. The court actually approved an injunction against the continued displacement of residents from the project area by SFRA, but it was pending a relocation plan that could be approved as satisfactory by HUD under the Federal Housing Act. And though they weren't ultimately successful in stopping full destruction, it was a huge feat that they were able to challenge such a large and powerful institution. And it was the first time in the country that this has done so, where a judge actually sided with them. Nevertheless, urban renewal affected a complete upheaval of the community in the Western Addition. And while the exact number of the displaced people is unknown, since the redevelopment agency's reports figures they've been inconsistent, and they likely didn't capture a lot of data from for many individuals and families, but the final combined tally for the 2 project areas is between 20,000 and 30,000 residents, mostly African American. In 1980, the district had 5,000 fewer housing units than had existed 30 years earlier. about 30% of a decrease. The approximately 2,000 affordable units that had been constructed were sufficient to house less than 1/4 of the displaced population. Not until 2000 did the number of units rebound to levels that approached those of 1950. Property owners were compensated with fair market value of their properties. However, the redevelopment agency, of course, employed tactics to ensure the lowest possible payment. Had homeowners had the opportunity to remain in and rehabilitate their beautiful Victorian homes, many would be worth millions today, assets that could have been passed along to successive generations. Renters were given relocation payments ranging from $50 to $1,000. However, about 60% of the residents self-located without any public assistance. It wasn't until 1955 that my family was able to move out of the Western Addition. Papa wanted a house. According to Aunt Barbara, the word went out to the Black neighborhoods that the realtors were opening up homes to buy. Papa wanted to move to Westlake, but they weren't selling homes to Black people then. So they were shown a house on Victoria in Ingleside, not too far from Daly City. There were a few Black families living on Victoria at the time. Barbara told me, or that's what she told me. I asked her what it was like living on Victoria, and she said it was great because there were a lot of families and everyone was so friendly. I probed her a bit for more details because I knew that at that time, real estate investors were executing profitable forms of racial steering like blockbusting, where they would stoke the fears of white residents, claiming that Black folks were coming to the neighborhood so they could make more money from the transaction. So I asked her, what would happen when one of the white families on Victoria would sell their house? And she said, well, every time a white family would move out, a Black family would move in, over and over and over again. Soon the church around the corner was all Black, and then we moved to Oakland. So I tell these stories because I want us to have a contextual understanding of what San Francisco has gone through that's actually very similar to a lot of the changes that have occurred not only in the Bay Area, including the East Bay, where again I'm from and have a lot more, I've done work and I'm writing a book on, but also to understand how these patterns aren't necessarily based on individual inhabitants. Instead, it's very much based on policy and so yes, preference, but certainly how these kinds of discriminatory patterns are in the built environment. They're in the way that we walk around, they're in infrastructure, they're in the way we understand and know property and property relations. And so as it relates to discrimination, which oftentimes is seen as something that's very individual, we have to also look at the kinds of policies that we're developing that are targeted towards individuals and not necessarily targeted towards a community. The ways that capitalism has us think is as individuals. So instead, the ways that multiple community organizers are having us think is to operate more as a community and know that we also have to sacrifice for the greater good. So in these kinds of understandings of how housing, or at least how to end housing discrimination, so much matters when we think about the history because it really ends up repeating itself. I tell my students all the time isn't linear, it's more of a circle. And so if we already know what the pattern is, then we should already know what doesn't work. We know what kind of worked, so we can add more to that in order to think about a possible future. I don't know how long I was talking, but that's not bad. Okay, good. So I actually wanted to take some time for questions because I do want to talk to y'all a little bit, but I also still wanted to leave up this census block data that shows you there's hardly any green on this screen, and green dots are Black folks. So I know we're here, but census data says we're not. So oftentimes when our populations, we could think about this in the same way the government thinks of indigenous populations. Because their numbers are so small, they actually get less funding. So the smaller our population gets, the less funding and functionality we'll actually have. So when you look at maps, and coming from a geography department, it's been really important to understand what maps tell us and who's able to generate the maps that matter and are viewed. These are the kinds of maps that actually don't necessarily help us because it makes it seem as though we're invisible. So how do we make ourselves more visible to make sure we have the power Two, change the conditions around us. So I wanted to leave this map up so you could take a look at who is operating, or at least who's able to have power and agency around the way the city operates. But yes, I want to open it up for questions if possible. 4%.
So the latest
2020.
looking like this
Worse.
sort of work.
I mean, yeah, this was 2010, and there were more in 2010. I think it was closer to 6% in 2010. So, you're welcome. Other one, yes.
Can you speak about the urban renewal project or the San Francisco Redevelopment Agency and their projects through 2009? Because I feel like a lot of people think that it's just the 40s and then the 50s. But as a child of the 80s, we were also displaced on this same thing. I think people are like, oh yeah, that stopped though.
No.
So I was just wondering if you could speak to the fact that it's a current.
Yeah, absolutely. So so I don't know if everyone heard the question, but it was about the impact of urban renewal and the redevelopment agencies, right? Because it's not just San Francisco, and I'm also a child of the 80s, and so I remember. So the Governor Newsom had decided that we need to shut down all of the redevelopment agencies because they were this scar on our history, right? So rather than actually addressing the harm, he just wanted to get rid of the agency. But not understanding that the agency was, of course, a part of the time, right? It was the federal government's initiative to modernize cities after the war, also after the Great Depression. Like, there were a number of reasons why redevelopment agencies came about. It was a logic that they wanted to modernize. But it continued because you could use redevelopment to impact war-torn, i.e. crack-torn neighborhoods, right? So the same kinds of initiatives were used by the federal, state, and local governments. Time, really? No. I'll finish this in a second. And I didn't even see you hold up time. I'm sorry if you did. Okay. So they were able to use these kinds of redevelopment actions to essentially get rid of people of color, particularly Black folks, in concert with law enforcement, in concert with lack of job opportunities, in concert with food deserts, or ways that there wasn't the kind of commercial development in areas. So redevelopment is planning, right? Like, it has really just turned around and become planning. And the kinds of logics that guide planning are very similar to redevelopment. So it didn't end. The fact that Western Addition A2 ended in 2009 shows you that there were still urban renewal projects that were going on through people's entire lifetimes. And the state and the city still use eminent domain to take property. So these aren't temporal logics. They're things that have continued for years and years and years. They just take on a different name. So you're absolutely right. It's still happening. And I want you, when you drive around, take Muni, whatever, look around to see how many empty lots there are. And you'd be so fascinated to find out how many are publicly owned versus privately owned. And the ones that have, and those huge parking lots, there's just flat, fallow land. Those used to be houses. Those used to be places where people lived and were in community. So it's not over. Like, it just has taken on a new name. But you can pay attention. You can see that yourselves and look it up. Okay, I'm done. I'm sorry. Thank you so much for listening.
Yes, my name is Piercy P.J. Bastiani III. I'm press with the San Francisco Bayview newspaper. I'm also the founder and president of the MAFH Security, Martial Artists for Hire. Today was exceptional in putting me in a space where I got to play a board game called Functionality, and I learned about discrimination in housing. And then I was able to attend a panel discussion with Bay Area policymakers and organization leaders on housing discrimination and other forms of discrimination. As somebody who has experienced housing discrimination, racial discrimination in San Francisco, who has lost housing over lack of a knowledge of resources accessible to me, legal representation, has experienced tenant-to-tenant harassment, the conversations that were had today and the resources that people have access to, it's so important that people are aware of what is out there to support them. Because for me personally, that could have been the difference between me and losing my housing in 2018, which had me working Mayor London Breed's campaign, working out of the campaign office and sleeping in the campaign office on a cot because my parents lived out of the city, but I was that committed to like do the work in the city and live in the city that I was doing that. I was living out of a car at that time throughout the campaign, where when in 2022, when the COVID rental protections were starting to be lifted and people's back rent was starting to come into effect, I had some back rent and I thought I was going to be good. And I missed a deadline on this funding program, Housing is Key. And just because I missed a deadline, I ran out of accessibility to funding for that period of time. I was looking at 12 grand that I was going to be owing, and I just went ahead and moved out and just, took a step out of that. But the whole thing is like, I didn't even necessarily have to do that because I had more accessibility through additional resources to either get funding, get legal representation, to stay housed, not be feeling like I was, forced out of my housing situation. So even for somebody like me who's like on the younger end of the spectrum, I'm still missing out on some of these accessibility things. So just imagine so many other people that are older or, come from all walks of life that are facing housing instability as a result of lack of knowledge and lack of information, dissemination of information of the resources that are available for them. So that's a big reason why this event was so pivotal in being able to bring so many different people from so many different walks of life to the same table here to be able to discuss like how do we end discrimination in housing.
Thank you, Dr. Summers. Another round of applause. Before I welcome Natalie, Natalie's visiting us from Baltimore. She's going to get into her work and what it looks like around redlining. Folks saw this and the feedback forms. So before you go, if you can take a second to jot some notes about your impressions. We have bags laid out all across the facility for the day. This is the first of what we hope to be an annual event that we expand over the course of a week. So this is our first Civil Rights Symposium iteration. The initial idea for this day came to us from the city of Baltimore, where Natalie is from. My good friend from college, his name is Raymond Baran. He was the director of the Civil Rights Division in Baltimore. He came out to join us today. But asked about stories about me from college. But he did this event in Baltimore, and we were going to build it out here. So with that, Natalie.
You say good morning, and on the first time, everyone says good morning back to you, as opposed to that little like, good morning. And then you gotta do it all over again, and you should have just said the first time, I'm about to say good morning to everyone. Can everyone say good morning back to me? So thank you for preventing me from having to do all that. Good morning, really excited. Really excited, thank you, to be with you all today. My name is Natalie Gillard, and I am the founder of Factuality. I have a background developing social equity initiatives. It's work that I've been doing for the last 17 years. And Factuality, which is a facilitated dialogue, it's a crash course, it's an interactive experience. It's designed to simulate the impact of fact-based inequities in the United States. The idea of that came to me almost 10 years ago, and I've been running this as a board game and also immersive lectures for the last 9 years. And for my breakout session, I'll be doing a couple of lightning rounds of the board game. And the main goal was to find the best way to engage diverse and, especially in this climate this year, diverse and divided groups in fact-based, meaningful dialogue. And the best way I was able to do that so far was through a board game. It started with me reimagining what the game Monopoly would look like if I were a pawn and the rules were based on the history of the United States. So first, as a woman playing Monopoly as myself, would my income be equitable to male pawns? As a Black person, given my understanding of policies and practices like redlining, would I be able to purchase property on the most desirable spaces on that game board? No, and no. And immediately I began to wonder, well, what would that look like for all of us if we, the people, had to play ourselves on a Monopoly board? How would we fare given the history of policies and practices in the United States? And then this thing called COVID happened, and I had to extract the core components out of the board game and move it into a virtual space. And then COVID is still here, but we're in a different place with it. And so I took those components and moved it into an immersive lecture. So it's going to be slightly immersive, but more on the lecture side because there's some really great content that I would like to share with you all today. But first we're going to play a little bit of a game because that's just what I like to do. So what you see on this slide is a list. And this is a list of my top 10 life must-haves. These are the things that I require to be the best version of myself. As you can see on the slide, it is as serious as my relationships in number 1. And as you can see in number 2, it says my dog. And I had no idea that pet love was a real thing until I got a dog. I did not. Anybody have a dog in the room? Like, I love my dog so much, like, I didn't even know it was a thing. As you can see, my dog is very important to me. I have a 6-pound Yorkie Poo named Cooper, and he's so cute. Anyway, across from the dog, you will see that it says my therapist. To know me is to know I do not play when it comes to my mental health. You get the best version of me when I prioritize my mental health, and it is always my hope that being this transparent about this nearly, or actually over 2-decade-long journey with my mental health, I always hope when I talk about it, it's a quick contribution to normalizing the narrative around take care of your mental health. Now, if you look in a few spaces below, actually let's go to 3 first. Shelter. We are here to talk about housing. Shelter, and especially for me in a safe neighborhood, are top tier on my list. And then if you go to the other side, it gets a little superficial in number 10. You'll see it says Apple products, which were letting us down today. But whatever. So what do you need to be the best version of you? I had some assistants passing out those little cards. There are 3 lines on one side of the card. You have a pen. If I can invite you all just to quickly write down what you require to be the best versions of yourself. You can take items from this slide if you so choose, or not, as I'm truly asking for what it is that you require. You have 2 minutes to get those 3 items recorded, and you can get started now. What do you need to be the best version of yourself? I know I have 2. If you only get 3, that's all we have time for today. What do you require to be the best version of you? All right, so we are almost at time. Should you require additional time to record your 3 life must-haves, you can take it. But for those who have completed, I would like to invite you to pair up with someone next to you. And I just want you to have a quick conversation about what is on your list and why. And see if there's any similarities, any differences, but what is on your list and why. You may have that conversation now. So I carry this whistle everywhere I go. I typically use it for board game facilitations, but I'm realizing even when I do immersive lecture, this is still a good way to quiet a room. So thank you so much. I love doing this activity, and I don't do it often at all, but it's always exciting to me to see how excited a room can get just to talk about what essentially is your value system. These are the things that you require to be you. In this space, we are excited to see what is on the other person's list. I'm hearing about similarities. I'm seeing things that I wish that were online, so I'm having a little bit of this heavy over here. But I want to ask the group, when you were partnered, did anyone have a list identical, like 100% identical to someone else that they were working with? What about 3?
We didn't get to 3 because we just talking about it too.
So ultimately, no one had a list identical, similar but not identical. Because we're not the same, and we always expect people just to show up a certain way, but in this moment we created so much space for authenticity. And what would happen if, after all the excitement about you just being you, I then say to you, Well, one of those items has to go just because of how you showed up today. Just because of what you look like, just because of your ethnicity, what you were born into, because that is what barriers to access to home look like to me. That just because of how you were brought into this world, now you can't live on this street, or you can't get this home loan. So after all the excitement, please look at your list and remove an item. Something has to go.
Oh, Lord.
And I want you to think about what that loss would mean for you. It's not fun now? Something has to go. Something has to go just because of who you are authentically. So remove that item from the list. I promise you we'll get back to it. And now we'll get into the facts. I feel like we didn't even have a conversation, but like the synergy is there. So I was excited about your talk. When I talk about redlining, I always like to start with Baltimore because that's when I first learned about redlining. I'm from Massachusetts. I lived in and around Boston for the majority of my life and somehow escaped without the accent, but that is where I am from. And then I popped into Baltimore, and I lived in Baltimore for over a decade. And when I first moved into Baltimore, I judged everything around me. I judged people who looked just like me in communities I've never seen before. And I had a supervisor, Dr. Sawyer, who gave me a book. It's called Not in My Neighborhood. It's by a Finnish author, and their name is Antero Fiatila. And they dive deep into the intricacies of something that was so new to me, redlining, which helped me to understand the composition of Baltimore City and why it looks the way it does today. So what you see on the slide is a redlining map. And in the initial conversation with Dr. Summers, we learned about the color coding and the grading system. So I want to dive a little bit deeper into what this map also represents. So first, the first ordinance for housing segregation was in Baltimore in 1910. That's really the reason why I'd love to get started there, because it goes back so far. And if you take a look at this map, you will see where my mouse is hovering. That is basically your city center, your commercial, industrial space that kind of loops around to the water. In the 1930s and under the Franklin Roosevelt administration was the creation of the Homeowners Loan Corporation. And they created a series of maps of every city-like metropolitan space in this whole entire country, shading in red all the areas where Black, African American, or the equivalent derogatory term resided. And that was regardless of income, regardless of status. If Black people lived there, it's shaded in red. I had the great fortune of connecting with a historian who then told me about what happened in some of the yellow spaces, which were oftentimes homes to ethnic, white, immigrant populations and some Asian populations who were not allowed to live in blue and green spaces which were reserved for white Americans. Now back to this map. Here's your commercial industrial zone, like your factories, for instance, intentionally positioning communities of color by factories, compromising air quality, looping around to the water, given the industry, the shipping of goods, the fumes, the rotting of meats, the sewage. We're going to position Black people there. And then in the decades that follow, once the industry shifts, we're going to now displace you. We are going to raise everything in sight. We are going to engage eminent domain, flatten your properties, and bring in these multi-million-dollar establishments. Generationally speaking, you will never have a chance to live there again. Now, to the right of this map is what is called a restrictive covenant. And for me, these are a little bit harder to come by. I actually have this document because it's attached to the home that I own in Baltimore. When I first moved into my house in 2016, my next door neighbor, Ms. Cheryl, senior citizen, says to me, I was able to access this neighborhood because I started off as the help. And that is the moment I felt like I left my body, because in 2016, for someone living to say to me, I was only able to be here because I was the help, I felt like, am I in 1916 or am I in the 1900s? Or am I in 2016 for someone alive to say this to me? And then a new neighbor moves in, we get a little familiar, they learn more about my work, and they said, Natalie, you need to go to the HOA meeting. You're gonna get a document and it's going to be wild. Under this strike-through text, it states, at no time shall the land included in said tract, or any part thereof, or any building erected thereon, be occupied by any Negro, that's me, or person of Negro extraction, To me, that's biracial, multiracial. America's little one drop rule, one drop of black blood makes you black. Let me take it from the top. At no time shall the lands included in said tract, nor any part thereof, or any building erected thereon, be occupied by any Negro or person of Negro extraction. This prohibition, however, is not intended to include the occupancy of a Negro domestic servant, Ms. Cheryl. And as more Negro help moved into my neighborhood, it triggered what is called white flight. A neighborhood that was exclusively white. And as people transitioned to whatever capacity, leaving homes to domestic help like Ms. Cheryl, it cleared out the white neighbors and moved in an almost exclusively black neighborhood to this day. Now, again, these restrictive covenants were eradicated in the Supreme Court case, Shelley versus Kramer, where a black family in St. Louis moved into a home and was told they had to vacate because of the restrictive covenant, and they fought and fought and fought all the way up to the Supreme Court, where 3 of the justices could not render a decision. Why? Because they too lived in homes governed by this racist document. Now, present day, depending on where you are in the country, it is illegal for me to have this conversation with you if you are publicly funded in places like Florida or Texas, where I used to have clients. It is now against the law to talk about what the Supreme Court's role was in housing segregation, but okay then, I'm glad that we're doing this today.
Wow.
San Francisco. I was diving deep into mapping inequality. I love that site. And you said, I'm like, okay, we need to talk like real. I was diving so deep into mapping inequality, and I love when I travel and do these facilitations or have these conversations that I wanna ground ourselves in an understanding of where we are physically standing. And if you see this little red circle, we are somewhere around here. But it's slightly above the red area because it wasn't fully developed at the time, where we are positioned right now. And the description on mapping inequality says the population of the area, while quite stable, is composed of lower income groups. While many of the inhabitants are of foreign extraction, no racial problem is presented. No racial problem is presented. That's the language. And then look at the consistency between the map of Baltimore and the map of San Francisco. Here would be like your pockets of commercial industry, for instance, always positioned by the waterway, your pockets of red, which pulls in black communities, some non-black communities, but not white American, as well as what occurs in some of the yellow spaces. So while on this deep dive into mapping inequality, I wanted to extract some of the language for just select areas. And this is a pretty large map, and here's only 3 areas that I wanted to focus on. And while I see you all taking pictures, lovely, I do have all the slides available to you, just FYI. Now, starting with the yellow area, and this is C6. It's considered the melting pot of the West and is the nearest approach to a slum district in San Francisco. It has a highly congested population consisting of Japanese, Russians, Mexicans, Negroes, etc., having a very low income level. In the north central part of the area is the largest concentration of Japanese in the city, and Negroes predominant in its northwest section. The southern part is much less affected by the racial situation. Only one mortgage institution was found who would even consider residential loans in this neighborhood. Only one. Why? Because of the racial composition, and for no other reason. Again, tying it to you just showing up as you today, and now your access is denied. In the red area, D1, there is a decided concentration of undesirable racial elements. More than half the Negro population of San Francisco are located here, and it is considered a highly hazardous area. D is for red and hazardous. And in the green, what does the green have to say? Reserved for white Americans. What does the green have to say? Property is zoned first residential and also protected by deed restrictions like the racial covenant I just shared. This is an exclusive and secluded area, and there is no possibility of invasion by undesirable social elements. Other areas that comprise the Bay Area, the language, if you dive deep into the language on mapping inequality about Oakland, next level, it is vile. It is, I encourage you to look. There are so many different descriptions around Oakland. It would require a whole other deck solely for Oakland and way longer than the 40 minutes that I've been allotted today. So I highly, highly encourage you to dive deeper into Oakland, take a look at the language for San Jose, and also to dive a little bit deeper into San Francisco. But these maps, there are 239 maps that the Mapping Inequality Project has been able to retrieve, and they also share that there could very well be more, they just haven't been able to find them. So as we discussed the language for San Francisco, the restrictions in Baltimore, understanding this pervasive nature, this is just a tiny, tiny little segment of what it looks like for the entire nation. Are we familiar with the Tulsa race massacre with the 1920? So a quick synopsis. May 31st, 1921 to June 1st, 1921, a mob inclusive of law enforcement, a mob inclusive of politicians stormed what was then regarded as Black Wall Street. There were overhead bombings and burning of homes with people in them and shooting of unarmed people, and no one was held accountable. Rumored hundreds of people dead, no one held accountable, no restitution for the crimes that were committed. Now here you have this map of Tulsa. Out of all the redlining maps I've seen, this is probably the poorest quality, but it still carries the story. And you can see where my mouse is hovering. Here are your pockets of red. Here's your commercial industrial zone, and again, sitting on the water. Now, to me, the epitome of adding insult to injury is the very next decade, the Homeowners Loan Corporation comes in and declares the area destroyed by mob violence as hazardous. It is now redlined. Destroyed by mob violence and now considered redlined. Why? Solely because Black people reside there. And if you ever watch shows like Lovecraft Country on HBO, and what's the other one? There's another one that was on HBO as well. The Watchmen. You will see depictions of the Tulsa race massacres. And for many viewers, it was the first time they had ever learned about this, because we like to bury things in history. And what we don't bring to the surface, we are inclined to repeat. In fact, this is an opt-in for many of us being here today. For those who do not come to this conversation, it becomes that individual who is that much more inclined to subject people to the very things we discussed today. So it is always best to opt in, and not all of us have the ability to opt out, but I always have to do this. I don't have a choice here. Look at some of the language that we see here. Tulsa riot. This was not a riot, it was a massacre. And in an effort to evade insurance claims, and there was just a judge ruling just to evade responsibility once more, it was declared a riot. We have 6/1/1921, and then we also have 6/16/2021, mob violence, but the location changed the United States Capitol. History continues to repeat itself, even independent of what we're discussing today. If you don't get to the core of the issue, it is going to present again. But what is the most striking to me here is that after all this violence, we declared the space hazardous. This code here on this slide, if you want to scan it, I'll leave it up for just another moment. If you're curious about any of the other racial crimes of this magnitude, CNN has a really, I don't even know how to describe it. It is a very eye-opening, interactive study that will show you more of these hate crimes throughout the United States. I'll leave it up for just a few more seconds before swapping slides. When is my time up? Oh, you let me know? Okay, all right. Federal Housing Administration. The FHA is responsible for ensuring less than 2% of Black home loans through the Fair Housing Act of 1968, or the FHA is responsible for failing to insure nearly 100% of Black home loans through the Fair Housing Act of 1968. However you want to present it or spin it, it's still atrocious. This picture here, the black and white picture, is in Detroit in 1941. It's taken from the book, The Color of Law. This wall was put up to separate a Black community from a white community. This wall still stands today in the 8 Mile neighborhood. There's a mural on it. In Baltimore, last year, the spike wall was removed by Morgan State, which is an HBCU, walking distance from my home. It was erected for a variety of reasons. One, there were neighbors who did not want to see Black students getting educated at Morgan State. There were neighbors who did not want to see Black people in the neighboring shopping plaza. And this wall just came down in 2023, y'all. And I see these walls, it's like they stand out to me everywhere I go in the country. I see them all the time. And I also notice that there is going to be a very distinctive population on one side versus the other. Now, 1941, which means World War II, ended in the years that followed. And 3 of my granduncles, I learned, fought in World War II. And when they returned from the war, they were denied their GI Bill benefits because the VA adopted the FHA policies and guidelines rendering Black veterans ineligible for home loans and also access to education. And so I say to my dad, who was part of the Great Migration out of the South, out of Jim Crow, South Carolina, my dad, who by the way remembers when it would say colored only or whites only at the supermarket, at the movie theater. My dad says to me, I said to him, have you ever had generational wealth? He's like, no. No, because of these policies, because of what happened to my uncles who were denied those GI Bill benefits, which many other groups were afforded. In fact, my parents tried to purchase their first home outside of Boston. They encountered racism. And when I go home to visit, we typically visit that area where the homes average about $1 million. Just like that goes generational wealth. If you look at this map of Detroit, you will see these little itty bitty numbers, which tells you if where you were standing was formerly redlined, but all you have to do is take a look at the environmental components to determine if that's the case. What is your proximity to highways, to water? What does the prevalence of pavement look like? How many trees or green spaces do you see? Helps me understand if where I am standing was formerly redlined. But when I see these little itty bitty numbers, they remind me of train tracks, which reminds me to tell you that in the 1950s, the government subsidized the cost associated with the construction of highways and trains by 90%. And with highways largely serving as an egress out of the suburbs, we trembled through Black communities, taking property through eminent domain, raising everything in sight, dropping in your train tracks, dropping in your highways. If you ever feel like you are, I mean, come on, like seriously, if you ever feel like you're on a train or a highway and it's literally going through a neighborhood, it's because we are a planned basket. We are, and it's by design. Boston, I'm from Massachusetts, I live in and around Boston. Part of the Mass Pike, which brings you east and west across the city, to make the way, to make space for the Mass Pike, they demolished part of a Black neighborhood that was anchored by a church. About 30 homes were destroyed. And there's a highway that goes to this area, but the homes around the highway all have values around close to $1 million, or about 15 minutes outside of Boston. Growing up as a kid, my mom would always say, Newton used to be Black, Newton used to be Black. And I was like, okay, and I was always so fascinated. Newton, Massachusetts used to be Black until this area was demolished. The legacy of redlining. Legacy is so interesting to me in this country because we could be so proud that everyone goes to Columbia or Harvard or its legacy, or we could be so proud that everyone has the same first name as a male in the family or takes over the family business. But when it comes to legacy of policy, it's like, I don't want to talk about that, but we talk about everything here. Zip codes overlap with redlining. Your zip codes determine where you go to school, how racially diverse it is, the quality of the education you receive, your access to employment opportunities, the quality of your neighborhood. This is a short list, by the way. The frequency in which your neighborhood is policed, your housing conditions, your property taxes, how much lead exposure you have. In Baltimore City, whether you have lead in your house or not, everyone has access and exposure because it's in the air. Back to the list. The quality of the air you breathe, the likelihood of having asthma, the quality of your mental health, your access to healthy and unhealthy food and alcohol. Ever wonder why there are so many liquor stores down to liquor in the title and communities of color? Do you know why? Anyone? Policy, zoning. Here's another excerpt from my covenant under the subheading of no nuisances, which, by the way, doubles as the heading for no Negro, no Negro extraction, the same clause. No nuisances, there shall not be erected, permitted, maintained, or operated upon any of the lands included in said tract, any brewery, distillery, or malt house, or no liquor in white spaces. Essentially, is what this says. What do we see decades removed? Back to the list, your life expectancy, the temperature of your neighborhood. When we were suburbanizing the United States, we were so intentional about the beautification of spaces exclusive to some and not so much for others, focusing first on the left, which was always yellow/red, tremendous access to pavement, the environmental components, tremendous access to pavement. When the sun hits that pavement, it heats up. The temperature is hotter and it could exacerbate existing respiratory challenges like asthma and cardiovascular disease in accordance with the American Heart Association. When the sun is beaming down all these tree canopies, grassy front yards and backyards, there is a buffer. It is cooler in the suburbs and hotter in the inner city. And it's all by design. And what we fail to see is that policies designed to impact one have a tendency to pull everyone else in. So how is it impacting all of us in this room today? Just because of how you showed up. And for the duration of the day, we're going to be moving to present day, but I wanted to close out talking about this still happens today. This couple, San Francisco area, purchased a home, $500,000 in renovations, and when the home got appraised, it was for $500,000 lower than what the market value was. They found a new appraiser. They eliminated all traces of blackness from their home. They asked a white friend to come in, and the appraisal went up $500,000. This is present day.
Good afternoon. My name is Deltrice Boyd. I am the Black to San Francisco coordinator with the Human Rights Commission here in the city and county of San Francisco. Today's event was about housing discrimination, and what I took away from the event today is that discrimination doesn't stop, it has not stopped, and it continues to stop, and it's enshrined in every single thing that we do, the policies that we adhere to on a daily basis, our economic stability that all communities strive for in society, and the intersections between urban areas such as Washington, D.C., Baltimore, Maryland, and here in San Francisco, in predominantly Black neighborhoods and spaces that were perpetuated over time since the Great Migration from the rural South to the urban North, and of course here to the West Coast in the Bay Area when jobs were available for African American men and women during the war. The fact that redlining is so prevalent in Black neighborhoods, how there are all type of policies that restrict us from building generational wealth, which we all know is key to economic stability here in the United States, and the fact that we as a society have done so little to right the wrongs of what has taken place against our community here in the United States of America.
Our topic today is how can we eliminate discrimination in housing? How can we make housing anti-racist? But it's bigger than that, right? It's the whole thing. That's what we're going to be talking about today. And we have a really accomplished group of leaders. I was really excited to read all of your bios. They've all worked in the areas of housing for low-income people and marginalized populations. Yeah, homelessness, displacement, right, from gentrification, all those things. I'm going to start by just telling you a little bit about all of them. Adrian Turtinati, I hope I'm saying that right. Here I am sitting right next to it. The heart of poverty in America is injustice. And that is a quote from Adrian. He founded Open Door Legal, or co-founded it, I should say, which provides universal access to legal services in San Francisco. And he believes that is the most cost-effective way of dealing with homelessness. He and others crunched numbers, and they found that Open Door Legal here in Bayview have reduced homelessness by 47% in this area, right? Okay, I want to make sure I got that right. Sitting next to Adrian, Courtney Welch. Courtney is the mayor of Emeryville. She's been on the city council there since 2021. She's a community advocate focusing on affordable housing, and she serves on the housing committee for the city of Emeryville. She was also the Affordable Housing Program Coordinator for home ownership in San Francisco. She's been working in this area for a long time. Thank you, Adrian. And Courtney, Logan McDonald, sitting next to Courtney, is the director of Keep People Housed in Oakland and Contra Costa County. It was founded when it became apparent that there was a serious problem of African Americans in Oakland being displaced because of gentrification. Right? But his work, a lot of his work now focuses on preventing homelessness, and he has worked in the whole area of housing programs and homeless services for almost a decade, right? And sitting next to Logan, Kevin Kish is a civil rights lawyer and the director of the California Civil Rights Department, appointed by Governor Newsom. It is the largest civil rights agency in the country, and it is the state agency for enforcing state fair housing laws that make it illegal to discriminate against anyone because of gender, race, sexual orientation, source of income, religion. This is the second time that he has headed that agency because he was also appointed by Governor Brown and served a term under him. So he's got some years, some perspective of years to help us understand today, to enlighten us with. I want to start out with one question for all of you. And if each of you can speak for just a few minutes on this, we want to make sure everybody has a chance to talk. So we're going to move it around real quickly. And I apologize if I become rude with that and jump in at some point. But I want to ask you, in your work, what does discrimination look like? What are you up against? Let's start with you. Because you're sitting next to me.
Today. Well, I do love being cold called on. And yeah, I would say at Open Door Legal, we are working to pioneer universal access to legal services with many other groups, but we are not there yet. And in fact, I believe that it's basically impossible to systematically address discrimination without universal access to legal aid, which is sort of what every other developed country has. Because there are so many ways that a discriminatory intent could sort of be manifested through kind of small legal violations, like a refusal to recertify, losing paperwork, a refusal, like doing sort of citations in a really aggressive manner against particular subpopulations. And if we're not kind of representing people in all of these small violations, it can sort of add up to a big sort of change, a big displacement over time. And I think we definitely see that in a lot of our work.
So what are the typical legal issues you're dealing with?
Well, we deal with a wide range of types of discrimination, but let's maybe say focus on racial discrimination. We don't see very many like provable racial discrimination claims, but what we do see is, let's say, a refusal to recertify, a refusal to amend leasing documents, frequently losing paperwork on behalf of like one particular racial group, refusal to process reasonable accommodation requests, or kind of things like that.
What do you mean by recertify? You have to educate me.
So when you're in subsidized housing, you have to go through a process of proving that you're income eligible every year. And you do this through submitting paperwork. It's called the recertification process. And what happens with some property management companies is you'll kind of submit the application and then they'll refuse to process it, or they'll say they lose it. And so in one case, for example, we had to sue the property management company to force them to recertify an existing tenant. And if they don't recertify, or they claim the tenant never recertified, then they can basically kick the rent to market rate.
Oh, okay. Mayor, let's have you talk a little bit about how you see, how does discrimination surfaced in your work?
Well, there's two pieces, I would say. As a mayor and a member of the city council, a lot of what we're dealing with is the after effects of what was once legal discrimination, and how, as an elected leader, you are moving forward with policies to try to address those issues, because it's a ripple effect. It might not be legal, but how it's rooted in our system is still very apparent today. So having to address it on the back end through policies, being strategic and being purposeful with inclusion. What does inclusion look like? Because the exclusion was on purpose. So what can we do moving forward to make sure that we are addressing the issues of the past in the present, and then making sure that we have a brighter future? So,
You said the after effects of what used to be legal discrimination. What are you talking about specifically?
Talking about what I'm assuming everyone here is a Bay Area resident, so the after effects of redlining and how that's affected communities, not just with housing discrimination, but how it's affected us health-wise. People who live in areas that were once redlined have lower health outcomes. We know that because of how the communities were designed. Those communities were disproportionately impacted by several different factors that impact our health. We know, especially here in San Francisco and even Oakland and Emeryville, pollution, and how communities were designed to experience some of the not so great things that impact our community, like traffic pollution, like traffic violence, and how we can redesign our communities to be safer for everyone. But it's focusing, having that racial equity lens, and knowing that, yes, the areas where even previously, as we're dealing with gentrification, but still many of our residents of color are still living in these communities. How can we not just design it, but also make it a priority when it comes to funding, to make sure that we're redesigning our communities to be safer and cleaner for the residents that live there now and then for the future?
So, when I think about discrimination, that's one of those things that's really hard to point out. We're living in a world full of dog whistle politics and all these things, all these ways to say something without saying it. But to echo Courtney, it's exactly what I'm trying to do now, is actually reverse some of the effects that we saw in the past. And we think about how we prioritize and actually using, because, since Prop 209 back in 96, they said that you couldn't use race as an indicator in California to actually say, this is someone that needs help, right? So what we use as a kind of proxy to race is we use the geography of redlining to actually prioritize people. So we serve people that live in those distressed neighborhoods, that have those, rising rents, stagnant wages, a lot of justice involvement, and we say that those are the folks that need to get prioritized. And, some of the things that I see specifically in terms of discrimination, and when we think about discrimination, it's not just about exclusion, it's about bias. It's about who we actually prefer. And sometimes I take a lot of referrals from different agencies, and I look at those referrals, and I actually categorize them based on demography to say, you know what, 70% of the people that we serve are, let's say, women, right? People that identify as women. Now, that seems to track a little bit because 70% of the referrals that come from you are also people that identify as women. But how come 65% of the people that we serve are Black or African American, but for some reason only 10% of your referrals are Black or African American? So that's my way of actually keeping track and saying, I know when someone's being biased and I call it out. So at least, and you can't train racism out of people, but what you can do is tell them that you're watching. So, you know.
Great. Well, you know, I want to thank Stevan and his colleagues for organizing this conference. I will tell you guys that when I asked him what topics we would be talking about in this panel, he said, I'm not going to tell you. I'd rather it be more of a conversation. So we're flying blind here, folks, with the questions that Wendy... So I lead the Civil Rights Department, and we are the state agency that for many decades has been the agency where if you feel that you've been discriminated against in housing, you can file a complaint. And our powers include investigating that complaint. We can mediate or try to conciliate, reach a resolution. And we are a public prosecutor. And that means in certain cases, we will go ahead and file a complaint in court challenging the alleged discrimination. I know that there was a history panel this morning. I wasn't here because I was coming up from LA where I live. But the history of discrimination, of detecting discrimination, you can see in what's called paired testing. Does anybody know what paired testing is? So you send, this is actually how it happened in California. There was a Supreme Court case. You send a couple or a renter of one race or religion or whatever characteristic you're testing for to see if there is a spot, right? And in the 60s, when we were doing this, you send them in person. Now you might do it online. And then you send another person or couple to see what they say. And if you were Black in the 1960s, in the case that her name was Dorothy Mulkey, she was a military veteran, and she and her husband were looking for a place to live in Orange County. And she would go to places and they would say, oh, you know what, we just rented the last apartment. You know what, we don't have anything here, but maybe in this other neighborhood. You know what neighborhood. There's something that we have for you. Or, oh, you know what, we just raised the rent. It's not what it says here in this newspaper ad, we just raised it. And so you would send then a white couple, in this case, and it's like, oh yeah, let's see it. Like, this is the rent, and here's the apartment, it's available. So when you ask, what does discrimination look like? Folks, sometimes it looks exactly like that in 2024. Sometimes it looks exactly like that. We do testing at the Civil Rights Department. For the first time in our department's history, we've been in existence since 1959, fair housing laws in California since 1963. We started doing fair housing testing 2 years ago. And we do see some of that. We see a lot of it around source of income. People who have government vouchers to help them pay rent. It's guaranteed rent, and it's flat no. It's turning people away. We also see, kind of like what the mayor said, vestiges of practices that used to be legal. Families with children get turned away. Right? We settled a case in the Bay Area last year for $3 million involving 48 properties where children were told they were not allowed to play outside, children of all ages, unless they were accompanied at all times by a parent. Well, guess what? Until the 80s, that was fine. There's a Supreme Court case, an appellate court case in California from the early 70s where the court upheld a rule that you could have a girl child of any age, but if you had a boy child, you had to move or be evicted when he turned 5. And the court said, that's fine. That's fine. Now that changed in the 80s, but we're still seeing that. So we see race, we see religion. We settled a case last year, egregious racial harassment. The interesting thing about the case is the landlord rented to the Black tenant. Right? The white landlord rented to the Black tenant and then proceeded to harass him in ways that were incredibly harmful, use of the N slur, and we settled that case for $20,000. Now, $20,000 is not an amount of money that in 2024 is going to change your life, but this was one unit, one landlord, and I think we sent a message that like, look, the state is gonna come in, even if it's one person, and stop this. So I'll end by saying, by far, the most common basis for discrimination that we see is disability. Disability cuts across every other identity marker. It cuts across age, race, religion, gender, and we see a lot of disability discrimination in housing.
You described how discrimination surfaces in your work. I'm curious, what are the stickiest discrimination issues that you have to deal with? If you just pick one sticky, like, oh no, this again, kind of thing.
Well,
Discriminations.
the most common, as the gentleman said, the discrimination cases we see are also disability discrimination in housing. Just constantly, refusing to rent to people with disabilities, refusing to process or honor reasonable accommodation requests.
Are these physical disabilities?
Yeah, physical disability. So we have a case right now with a gentleman who is wheelchair bound. He was given a 5th floor apartment in a building without an elevator. And he has to kind of get out of the wheelchair and carry the wheelchair up. And he's been requesting for 4 years to be moved to a lower floor, and they've just refused to process the request.
So where's that lawsuit right now?
It's in process. But that's just one example of hundreds. So I would say stickiness also with small property owners. We see a lot of gender discrimination or sexuality discrimination. So I've seen a couple small landlords do like homophobic slurs against their tenants. I had one landlord that would like scream death threats to his tenant through the wall every night. Things like that.
Well, mine aren't like that. It's mainly we do see a lot of the income discrimination. Obviously, I am not directly responsible for addressing any type of discrimination, but as far as complaints, things that are brought to the city council, when we receive emails, it can range from the income discrimination piece where someone does not want to take someone who has like a Section 8 voucher. We have seen general locations have issues with just serving their tenants properly. There's been an ongoing issue with a property management company. Their tenants essentially feel abandoned by the property management company. They are doing what is called cloud or remote management, so they don't have someone that's actually their property manager at the property every day. Now, they do still have maintenance folks that are there, so if there's any maintenance issues, but as far as this is the property manager, you can come and make an appointment and speak with them. There is not a property manager on site. Everything is done either via email, via phone. If you need to set up an appointment to meet with them regarding recertification, all of that is done online. Now, that sounds fine in general, but it feels as if there's been a lot of delays in communication. There has been a lot of turnover as far as who is the exact point person. So there's been issues that have come up around safety and just reliability of the communication. And it's not discrimination, right? The way we talked about, sometimes it's very vague, but you don't see that type of behavior with HOAs, where people actually own the condos or they own the townhomes. It feels very specific around tenants. And mind you, the specific property, it is mixed, it's not mixed use, but it's inclusionary. So there are both market rate and below market rate tenants that are living at this property. But you just typically don't see this behavior with people, with HOAs, with condo owners, with townhome owners. It feels very specific to renters. It feels very biased and it reminds me of just the general narratives around who renters are and the level of respect that they should receive in their homes. And so that's a common issue. And like I said, it's not specifically discriminatory the way we think about someone being discriminated against or refused housing, but the level of service that tenants are receiving does feel like it can be a lower quality than when people are owning their condos.
That's valid. If it's a systemic thing, that's cool. That's fine to answer in that way, Logan.
Yeah. Well, first off, I'm gonna apologize to you. You're Mayor Welch. You know, I didn't mean to call you by your first name. We're cool, but I was
always Courtney with friends.
all right. I was too comfy. I got to put respect on it. So, but in terms of what I see in discrimination with the work that I do, we try to be as proactive as possible when it comes to actually prioritizing these groups. So, disabling conditions, that's a priority point. Not having your name on a lease, that's a priority point. And also something that we see often is who's going to take the financial assistance from us. Sometimes you see landlords just not want to work with you. And that's when we actually had to make some exceptions to say, we're just going to give it straight to the person and let them pay it, right? But that's one of those things where, the auditors come and they say, well, you're just giving people cash directly, you're doing this, you're doing that. And, you just stand on it and say, yeah, because of these reasons. So, the direct cash transfer is a key piece. And just in general, I think one thing that I see often is how predatory landlords treat women, and that's always unfortunate because when you get into like the nitty gritty on that, you start seeing that a lot of women have to deal with things that a lot of men don't in terms of.
What are you saying?
Well, just, I guess like the quid pro quo, if you do this for me, you can stay in the unit, and that's so that's something that you have to, it's a real thing, and it is discriminatory.
So the question is, what's the stickiest issue? And by sticky, I think you mean like, what's the hardest to kind of figure out and solve, right? And I would say the clear answer for me is tenant-on-tenant harassment. Harassment is a unlawful civil rights violation, just like in the workplace, right? It's a form of discrimination. So harassment on the basis of sex, the way you just said, on the basis of gender, on the basis of race, religion, what have you. When a landlord or a property manager is harassing a tenant, that's pretty easy, right? Why? Because the landlord has the power to stop or can be punished for not stopping. Same with the property manager. You can fire a property manager. And so in that way, it's like the workplaces where we all work. If somebody is harassing somebody else at work, guess what? They get fired. Or they can't be fired if the harassment is severe and pervasive. What happens though when it's tenant on tenant, one tenant against another tenant, which is very common? Who has the power to do anything about that? Well, it depends. So one big issue is free speech, right? I work for the government. We can't punish people for things that they say that are within their free speech rights. You're allowed to say offensive things. Right. In the government that I work for, in the department, I'm not going to take somebody to court for saying something that is protected by their free speech rights. Right?
I can do what Stone Cold does.
All right. The other issue, though, in tenant-on-tenant harassment is mental health conditions. What do you do if somebody is ill, is struggling? If somebody threatens another tenant and it's because they're having a mental health crisis? That is really tough, folks. And so you can walk through a hypothetical. Somebody tries to assault another tenant with a weapon or something, and then they say, well, actually, I was having a mental health crisis, and you need to reasonably accommodate my disability, because mental health conditions can be disabilities, right? So what do? Well, maybe you work with that person and their doctor. Maybe they were not taking medication that they're supposed to be taking. Are they willing to be monitored? If so, maybe that's a reasonable accommodation and you don't evict that person even though they threatened another tenant. But maybe they aren't willing to be monitored, and maybe then they pose a threat that you can't mitigate in legal terms, you can't reduce, and so they can be evicted. But you see, we're asking landlords in that circumstance to do very complicated legal and practical risk assessment and analysis, and that is very sticky.
That is very sticky. I want to get to solutions now, and I want to ask each of you, what are you finding to be the most effective ways, right, of deterring discrimination? Any kind of stuff.
No, I love being last.
Adrian, you want to start? Or Logan, you want to start?
I can start.
Yeah, go for it.
You know, not to be shameless with the plug here, but I do think that homelessness prevention is key. So interestingly enough, in 2015, an organization called Destination Home did a study on the average cost of one unhoused person on the street. And it's not just services, it's also utilizing the emergency rooms, it's the fire department, it's all these other kind of overhead pieces. And it was between 60,000 and 100,000 per person per year. Now, if you compare that with homelessness prevention, it's about $5,800 per household one time. And it's really just saying that snowball effect that starts where it just keeps getting bigger and bigger until you become someone that might be facing chronic homelessness, just not letting it happen in the first place. So not only do you actually reduce all of the kind of possibilities around the trauma that's associated with homelessness and the statistic likelihood that they'll fall into homelessness again if they do it once, but it's also fiscally responsible in terms of the budget, you know. So I think that that's probably the best intervention that I could offer.
What are the specific services that make a difference?
So financial assistance, helping with back rent. Depending on which funders are involved, it's also maybe a shallow subsidy that could reduce the rent burden. But then it's also, in terms of the intervention to have the long-lasting effect, it's vocational support, housemate matching, downsizing into more affordable units, and just a whole bunch of different things. Legal aid, that's a big one. Definitely legal aid support. Yeah, so right. So those are the big things.
Mayor?
Well, my predecessors were very forward-thinking. In 2018, the city of Emeryville passed a $50 million affordable housing bond, which was one of the highest per capita in the state's history. And we then did our expenditure plan in 2020. And so we have been actively spending that $50 million, which is not that much money once you start getting down to the development, but really prioritizing what I had spoke about earlier was who's been left out of housing thus far, and looking at it through a racial equity lens, a gender equity lens, an economic equity lens. So at this moment, we're actually building up at the corner of 36th and San Pablo, which will be one of our newer units, the Nellie Hannon Gateway. It'll be 90 units of permanent supportive housing, and in the ground floor, ECAP, which is the Emeryville Citizens Assistance Program, which does 7 days a week of providing food for the community. We'll have a fully built out new kitchen. They'll be able to do indoor dining and be able to serve at a much higher capacity. And so that's just one representation of us thinking about who is frequently discriminated against when it comes to housing. It's individuals who have experienced chronic homelessness. Typically, those individuals are living with disabilities. Many are seniors, and that's actually a growing population. And Logan could probably speak to that as well. So we're forward thinking about who is at highest need and how can we use this money critically to address not just housing insecurity and homelessness, because we know once folks end up on the street, it is very, very difficult to get them back. And the longer you stay homeless, the harder it is to get you housed securely, because so many different issues come with that. So that's what we've been doing. And I look forward to hopefully passing our regional housing bonds in November, because that will be $20 billion $20 billion going to the region. Alameda County will get 2.1 billion. Oakland and San Francisco get their own allocations. So I'm really looking forward to that because we've seen it. We know that investing in housing, especially housing for our most vulnerable populations, really works. And that helps lower the instances of discrimination. You're not having to worry about someone rejecting your voucher because you've got an abundance of housing that serves specifically those populations, just for example.
How many units have you been able to build in Emeryville?
Oh,
with 50.
At this time, that 90 is our first round. Moving forward, we're working with EAH to develop we're expanding Christie Park. It'll be down in the Christie Core area. That'll be about 360 units. We're also building about 50 units of intergenerational housing. So we'll be serving formerly homeless Tay youth and also formerly homeless seniors. So that'll be about 50. So what's the math on that, Wendy?
I don't know that, but
40 and 50?
what I am curious about, math-wise, I'm very bad at it, but how can you do all that with 50 million?
So it's not just the building of the units, it's also investment in our below market rate home ownership program. There are a few different areas that we're spreading this money over, but to answer your question, by passing our bond, we also have accessed funding from both the federal and state government, and so we're able to layer all of that funding. So it's not just the 50 million alone, there's also investments that come in from other sources as well.
Good news. That's a good news one. Adrian?
So if we're going to think about deterrence, I think one of the most robust findings from criminology is actually that bad actors are not really deterred by the severity of punishment, but by the likelihood of punishment. And if we apply that to discrimination cases, it kind of means that pooling our resources into doing large class actions or the major enforcement actions is not going to have as much effect as basically guaranteeing help in all the small cases. That's going to move the needle in terms of discrimination much faster because these class actions, they're almost like the death penalty of civil law. They're so infrequent and they take so long to process that it actually doesn't, I think, result in a lot of change from bad actors.
So it's more legal aid on the ground?
Legal aid on the ground for everyone who needs it. I think that's going to move the needle the fastest in terms of deterrence. And in this neighborhood, what we've tried to do is that. So we do a lot of areas of law, not just housing, but housing is about a third of all of our cases. And in this neighborhood, about 20% of the entire population has come to us for legal help, and we've represented about 5 to 10 families on every block.
Wow. That's amazing.
Thank you.
Okay, maybe, go ahead. Did you want to say something?
No.
No. Kevin, we pass it down to you and talk about this class action lawsuit.
Yeah.
I mean,
Well, look, I think a lot of things are true. I think I agree with all of the panelists. If you live in a condition of scarcity, and we do when it comes to housing, then people are fighting, right? And they're fighting, and that fighting falls along familiar lines sometimes. So increasing housing, making it more available means that single mom doesn't have to think about whether she's going to submit to sexual harassment because there's somewhere else for her to go. Or that voucher holder, there's somewhere else for them to go. So I do think that scarcity matters. It's also true that, when our civil rights laws at a national level were passed in the 1960s, largely, there was a strand of thinking that said, now discrimination will go away. Because now people know that it's wrong and unlawful. LOL, right? We know that that's not what happened. And so to Adrian's point, there's also an incredible justice gap that, frankly, the legal profession has not solved. So I'm really interested in learning more about this model of providing kind of uniform legal services to anybody who needs them. We know what happens in eviction courts. When people have lawyers, they don't get evicted. When they don't have lawyers, they do get evicted, right? So we know that there is this justice gap. I do, however, think that there is value in big cases sometimes, particularly when brought on the part of the government, to send a message. Because what happens then is that all the landlords associations, all the realtors associations, they publish it in their newsletters, and it reaches people who have not been reached about this stuff. And I do think that it causes people to think twice. But the bottom line is, whether you're talking about a legal aid model of providing services to people who need it, who walk in the door, or a kind of impact litigation model of bringing big cases, the laws don't enforce themselves, right? They require vigorous enforcement at every level, or they are meaningless. And laws are promises. Right? Laws are promises that we have made to ourselves about what we will and won't accept in our society. And when we don't enforce them, we're breaking that promise to all of us.
My name is Courtney Welch, and I'm the mayor of the city of Emeryville. I was here at the Civil Rights Symposium talking about discrimination in housing. I was there with an amazing panel. Really what I think we drove home was that where discrimination still exists, that we're moving forward and there are proven solutions to addressing discrimination in housing. Next year, I hope this event is even bigger. I hope I'm welcome back and that we can do more of the important work to make sure that we're living in an equitable and inclusive society.
As Stevon said, we're now ready to look forward. We spent the morning learning about some of the history of housing discrimination, and the panel just now talked a lot about the struggles that we're dealing with today. And now we've got a chance to look forward into the future and, recognizing that the future is now in many ways. And we're very fortunate to have Catherine Bracey with us. Catherine is a civic technologist and community organizer whose work focuses on the intersection of political and economic inequality, and also is the founder and CEO of Tech Equity. And I'm hoping that we can start with you sharing a little bit more about yourself and your background and what led you on the path to this work.
So I have been working at the intersection of technology and civic participation in some way, shape, or form for basically my entire career. I was doing tech policy work at Harvard when the social web was kind of born. Mark Zuckerberg and his co-founders were in school there when we were working, and I then joined the Obama campaign, the re-election, and worked on the technology team there. And when the campaign was over, I joined an organization called Code for America, which is based in San Francisco, that partners with local governments to use technology to improve service delivery, mostly for things like food assistance, criminal justice, things like that. So. And then in late 2015 is when I got the idea to start Tech Equity, and it was spurred by a decision that Uber made to move to downtown Oakland. They bought the old Sears department store at 19th and Telegraph, and at the time I was living right across the street from that building, and for those of you who remember this period, it was not a very popular announcement, and I understood why, but I hadn't at that time in my career spent a lot of time thinking about the role of the tech industry, like in the place where it was based. I spent a lot of time thinking about the internet and citizenship on the internet, but not a lot of time thinking about the role that the tech industry was having on the community. And it was a very sort of eye-opening experience for me, and I started thinking a lot about like how had we gotten to this place where the most valuable, at the time, Uber was the most valuable privately held company in the world. And that neighborhood in downtown Oakland, I think the median income was about $25,000 a year. And the idea that moving 2,500 really good jobs to that place would be seen as a threat instead of an opportunity was a very sort of galvanizing thing for me. And I started doing a lot of thinking about why that was. Was it something that was specific to, the tech industry? Was it something about the politics of the region? Was there something about California and, structural issues here? And more importantly, what would have to change to get us out of that place? And it turned out the answer was it was kind of all of those things, and also that the tech sector was really not participating as sort of citizens of this place. And I saw an opportunity to sort of create a political vehicle for not the tech companies so much, but the tech workers to participate in conversations about how we could make the Bay Area economy, the tech-driven economy of the Bay Area, work for everybody. And that led us down a path of really realizing pretty quickly that housing was the key to that people couldn't afford to live where the economic growth was happening. Then it was going to cause, then the growth of the tech sector was going to cause displacement and inequality rather than broad-based opportunity. So that's where we started, and that's kind of, I can talk more about the road we've taken over the last 8 years that has been winding, but that's how kind of housing became a centerpiece of the work that we've been doing since then.
Thank you. And I do also just want to let everybody know this is supposed to be a fireside chat. And we were told by the fire department we're not allowed to actually set any fires in here. But we do have a lot of good energy, a lot of good insight, a lot of sharp minds in the room. And we want this to be a conversation. So there will be opportunities for questions a little bit later on. I'm going to try to get us started focusing on the topic of artificial intelligence's grip on housing discrimination. But just one last question before we get to the main topic. What can you tell us about world eaters?
Yeah, the other thing I just did is finish writing a book about venture capital. And sort of long story short, at some point of doing this work, I came to the realization that there were structural challenges inside the tech sector that were making it harder for companies to do the right thing. And it had very little to do with technology itself. It had a lot to do with the economic structure that undergirds the tech industry, and that's of course venture capital, and that few people who do advocacy in the space, even on tech policy, really even understand how venture capital works, let alone the way in which it influences business models and decision making. And I saw that we really kind of needed that. So the book sort of lays out a little bit of my journey of getting to that conclusion, and then also looks at the experience of people on the ground who are impacted by tech or tech companies, and draws that line back up to the economic incentives that venture capital creates. So there is a chapter on housing, and it does speak a lot to the tools that we're going to discuss today. And so this is all to say, like, everything we're going to discuss about the technology really needs to be held in the context of the business models and the investor incentives that are driving all of the decision making, explicitly or implicitly. And that's a really important context to understand if we're going to make policy or do advocacy that is going to be sustainable and effective.
And the book is coming out in March, is that right?
Yeah, this is not a plug. This is...
For anyone who's interested, keep an eye out March of next year.
It is on pre-order on Amazon.
Great. Well, I want to mention for anybody who may not be familiar that a lot of the topics we're going to be talking about in terms of artificial intelligence and discrimination are covered to some extent in this report that just came out from Tech Equity in July, and you can find that report on the website at techequity.us. So anybody who wants to follow up on these topics and dig a little deeper, that's a great starting point. And I want to move into that topic and ask, because this is a complex issue and the technology that we're talking about itself is very complex, and then the social context that it operates in has so many layers that it can be difficult to know even where to start the conversation. And so I'm curious if you can tell us, because we don't have time for a whole semester-long course on these issues. If you can tell us what are some of the most fundamental ideas that people need to grasp in order to have a sense of what's happening with artificial intelligence and housing discrimination.
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing is that there is I think, you know, a lot of us think of AI as sort of chatbots, chat GPT, and obviously that has, you know, the sort of chatbot generative AI bursting onto the scene has captured a lot of people's attention and has created some urgency around regulation. But, you know, artificial intelligence is much broader than that. And, you know, the kinds of tools that we're talking about here are not really that new. It's really about, you know, algorithms. Any tool that makes a decision, a machine is making a decision that a human may have made in a previous, you know, iteration. And that doesn't have to be generative AI where, you know, the tool is sort of quote unquote thinking and sort of generating the next response based on like an interaction that you're having in real time with it. It's, you know, any tool that's sort of ingesting data for the purposes of spitting out a decision or a conclusion, and that there's some mechanized process that spits out that decision. So it isn't actually that complicated. I mean, I think that that's one thing that one tactic that the industry has used to like prevent regulation and to sort of control how these tools are used is to use the complexity of the technology to sort of wield power over how decisions are made. Like, oh, you can't possibly understand what we should do about this because it's so complicated and you're not an engineer. And that's just like, yes, they are, you know, complex tools, but like so are automobiles, and that doesn't prevent us from regulating automobiles. So I think if there's one thing I hope people take away from this, is that that people feel more empowered to engage in conversations about the way that technology is impacting our lives. We are all experts on that, and we don't need to be engineers in order to engage in a conversation about that.
So we're going to focus primarily on housing, but I also wanted to sort of set the stage and ask if there are other areas where we're seeing issues with algorithmic bias that are playing out, maybe in employment or criminal justice, that you think people should be aware of.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've kind of, the topic that's been in the news a lot is labor, so in the labor market and whether these tools are going to displace workers, and there are other ways in which these tools come into the workplace that can be harmful or helpful. Less reported on areas are things like healthcare. So there are a lot of tools that sort of diagnose and provide recommendations to doctors and nurses, healthcare providers about how they should treat patients. That in some settings, nurses are required to follow those recommendations, which, as you can imagine, can have bad outcomes for patients. There is obviously in use in the criminal justice system to do things like set bail or make sentencing decisions. Yeah, I mean, there are any area you can think of. There's one example that just was, there was a long story in the New York Times about the Spanish government using AI to determine whether a domestic abuser was likely to reoffend, and where those tools made the wrong decision and women ended up dead at the hands of their partners. So there's just, I mean, every kind of aspect of our lives that you can imagine that are sort of high risk and high stakes. There is probably an AI system that is being used in some way in those areas. And housing is the one that, you know, we are, housing and labor are the two that we are most focused on.
So can you tell us a little bit about how bias comes into the artificial intelligence results? Is this because programmers are racist and misogynist and they want the technology to discriminate, so they write it that way? Or is it something about, you know, how they're getting information?
Yeah, I mean, it's not that simple. It might be easier to solve these problems if it was. But I mean, I think we're all familiar with how bias and discrimination lines up in systems, and it's not necessarily sort of, you know, Nazis and KKK and, you know, the sort of in your face type of thing. It's much more insidious than that. And really the thing that I find so fascinating about generative AI in particular is that these models literally have consumed all of the information on the internet, which is almost the entirety of human knowledge that has been written down or sort of made into a media form. And so it is really like a funhouse mirror of human experience. And that is so fascinating to me. Also a little scary, of course. And of course, humans are not perfect. And so everything that's wrong with humans is getting ingested into this machine and sort of clarified and processed, and, you know, out comes a Twinkie, you know, that tastes kind of good, but it, you know, is really bad for you. I'm taking this ultra processed metaphor a little too far, but, you know, I mean, it is really just the entirety of human experience and knowledge, asterisk. And for the decision-making systems, a vast array of data. I mean, you would be shocked if you knew like the extent of the data that these systems had ingested and were collecting, and the market for that data behind the scenes that is fueling some of the decision-making. So it really is like a reflection of just the baked-in discrimination biases that exist in society and have existed forever. And the question is, how do you identify that, make it clear, and, you know, not let it, I don't know that we're ever gonna get to a point where we're gonna like sanitize these tools to the point where they're completely objective, but how do we like create the context around the use of these tools to limit or mitigate the harm? And then how can we create the context so that as these tools are deployed, they're actually helping to reduce the bias that we hold. And I think there's a lot of promise for that as well.
So one of the topics that I hear a lot about in this subject area is about transparency and unequal access to information. And one example that I think of related to that is something that came up many years ago when there was reporting from ProPublica on Facebook's advertising system that allowed advertisers to select who they want to see their advertisements. And early on, they could select based on factors like age, sex, or even racial characteristics. After that was called out and removed as an option, there were still other methods that they could use to target people based on other factors that correlate with race, like their zip code. But the difficulty was that the people who were being discriminated against were the ones who didn't see the ads. So they had no way of knowing that they were left out and that they didn't see that job advertisement, or they didn't see that advertisement for an apartment rental. So how can that be balanced out, or what can we do about the things we don't know?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think that's the most the most urgent thing to address, and I think the difference with AI systems and like human systems in these decision-making processes is that it is almost impossible to understand how the tools are being used and when they are being used on you. In the report that you mentioned that we just published is about tenant screening tools, and we surveyed I think 400 landlords and 1,000 tenants in California. And of the tenants we surveyed, I think like 3% of them knew that when their applications were screened, they were screened by an automated tenant screening system rather than the landlord themselves. So like starting from there, like there's this sense that like you don't even, at least when you're applying to a landlord who's doing a human screening, you know that the landlord is the one, or the property management company is the one who is evaluating your application and doing the screening and requesting, the credit report or whatever. If they are using a tenant screening company that's just like spitting back a score or recommendation, that that tenant screening company is really the one that's making the decision, because the vast majority of times the landlord is, we're just taking the recommendation that is given back to them. And if that tool has made a decision that is violating your rights, you don't even know, first of all, you don't know that. Second of all, you wouldn't know what company to follow up with to like pursue your rights. So it's adding this additional layer that alienates people from the decision. And then for regulators, it's almost impossible to look under the hood and say like, okay, well, what data are you taking into account? Like, for example, in some jurisdictions, it's illegal to use certain criminal data to make decisions about tenant applications. And most of these tools are consuming that data, but are not reporting that. And so it's just, it's almost impossible to do. I know it's hard to do that in, the current state, right? But it's almost impossible to do when these tools are being used at the same time. So that lack of transparency is really the critical factor. And it's the thing that we are focused on the most, both in the tenant screening arena, but also in the rental market price setting arena. I know that this is something that's been in the news recently. The City Council just unanimously passed a law to ban price setting algorithms in the rental market. That is data about like the individual price level of units over time that landlords have and are weaponizing against tenants. And tenants do not have access to that same data, and they don't have the tools that landlords have to do predictive analysis and set the optimal price. So, tenants can't enforce their rights, advocates can't, for example, understand whether the statewide rent cap is being violated. We just don't know because we don't have that data. I know the city of San Francisco is collecting that data, but I don't have any sense that they're doing much with it. But that's a great first step, so like developing that transparency, getting tenant advocates to understand that data is actually really powerful. It is as powerful as money. I think is really the key to unlocking, rebalancing power in this arena as technology becomes more ubiquitous.
Thank you. I'm happy but not right now.
Thank you. And so I do want to talk about some other recent developments as well. And there have been a couple of things that happened at the federal level within the past year. In October, President Biden issued an executive order mandating federal agencies to study and publish guidance on artificial intelligence. And if you go and read that executive order, it seems to really be painting two very different pictures of artificial intelligence. On one hand, it talks about the potential to help solve urgent challenges while making our world more prosperous, more productive, innovative, and secure. But then if you read other parts of the order, it talks about how irresponsible use can exacerbate societal harm, such as fraud, discrimination, bias, and disinformation, and can stifle competition and pose risks to national security. This leaves me, in the housing context, wondering, is this a great tool? Is it, should we be looking to AI for solutions to some of the problems that we've encountered, or is this, the biggest threat that we need to put up a defense against?
I mean, I think it is a powerful tool, and it is a tool. That's the sort of main thing, and the values for whether it's going to be used for good or for evil are not about the tool. They're about the context in which they are deployed, and it's about the power dynamics around them. And that's why I wrote this book about venture capital, because I think that's like the most critical determining factor of whether the tools are going to wind up creating harm or be used irresponsibly or not. And so our work is really focused on making sure that the context into which the technology is developed and deployed is going to optimize for the positive outcomes and not the negative outcomes. And we can't do that. I'm here because I want to plea, put out a plea to all the people who are working on these issues on the ground to really see this as a critical part of the work that they're doing. Like we can't create that context without the people who are, fighting for housing rights every day, understanding that as a critical component to ensuring that these rights are protected in a sustainable way going forward. And so, uncovering how tenant screening tools are creating bias, making sure there are public options for the data that will fuel these tools, creating publicly owned compute resources so that as generative AI becomes more ubiquitous, there are that those resources are available to people who want to build tools in the public interest and not just in the corporate interest. Those are all really important things, and they require us to do power building work on the ground and really develop a political voice around AI and how it's connected to all these other issues that we care about. So yeah, I'm very bullish on technology in general. I mean, I've been working on this stuff for my entire career, and I really, I use the tools myself, and I find them sparking my imagination, and I want that to be true for everybody. And right now we don't have the context for that to be a reality.
So for anyone who's interested, the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development did put out some guidance this May following up on the executive order, and there's a lot of detail in there similar to what Catherine's talking about, describing some of the topics that we need to be thinking about and studying and how we need to go about getting more information. We've also recently had some developments at the state level with the California Civil Rights Council putting out some proposed regulations that pertain to the use of automated decision-making systems in employment. And for anyone who's interested, there's detail online on the California Civil Rights Council website about that. I'm curious if you're aware of any examples, maybe from other states or other cities, different approaches to legislation that are happening or that we might want to use as examples?
Yeah, there's actually another bill right now in Sacramento that is, fingers crossed, going to be on for a floor vote later this month. AB 2930, which is the bill to regulate automated decision-making systems in high-risk use cases, so education, healthcare, criminal justice, housing, the workplace. And this would we have three sort of principles that we think any legislation that touches AI should hold. One is that people who are affected by the technology need to have agency over the tools, that they have an input on how those tools are used on them, and have some way to help design them as well. The second is that accountability for harm needs to live with the companies, and that both regulators and individuals need to be empowered to hold companies accountable. So this means auditing tools before they're released. We like to think about this as sort of the FDA model. Like, we would not accept it if companies just put drugs into the market without being approved first. So there's a long history of sort of product safety principles, and we think that those kinds of principles should apply to AI, especially in these high risk environments. And then the third piece is about that corporate power piece. We do need more transparency, more power over our own data. There needs to be more competition in the marketplace in order to make sure that the power balance is the right power balance. Right now, these companies have way too much power, and that's driving a lot of the harms. So those are sort of the three overall policy principles. There's one bill about automated decision-making systems that would kind of hold down that middle principle about putting accountability on the companies, but also gives people a little bit more control over understanding how these tools are used against them or on them or with them. And that bill is, looking pretty good. I mean, I think if it stays in its current state, it will be the most powerful, I guess, legislation in the country. There is a law that passed in Colorado earlier this year that is slightly weaker, and industry is going to work to chip away at it already. It doesn't even go into effect until, I think, 2026. So there's that may or may not end up looking like good legislation. It's absolutely impossible to get anything done at the federal level So I think there's a good shot for California to have the strongest legislation on this front in the country. And it's not just the Civil Rights Department that's doing this rulemaking. The Privacy Agency is also doing rulemaking on all high-risk use cases, not just in the labor context. So that's really important to watch for advocates. Industry is also going to war on that. So it's really important for us to be engaged and make sure that they're not able to co-opt the process. They've already delayed putting the rules into effect because of some chicanery that industry did at the last hearing. So there's just a lot of different areas that the state is playing on this. And I'm actually pretty hopeful. Like, if you had asked me at the beginning of the year if we would have made this much progress, I would not have thought we would have gotten this far. And that's great. I mean, I think we made a mistake. I was one of these people in the mid-2000s who thought we needed to let social media kind of do its thing and see how it developed, and that regulating it was the worst thing we could do. And that did not work out so well. So I've learned my lesson. And I think that it's important for us to put in place common sense guardrails now, iterate on them over time as the technology develops, of course. But we can't just, let 1,000 flowers bloom and companies do whatever they want and, experiment on the public and see how it turns out.
So you referenced the local legislation that was passed just this Tuesday at the San Francisco Board of Supervisors that targets rent-setting software. And I wanted to point out that that legislation really was developed in response to an article from ProPublica in October of 2022 that talked about RealPage, which was the company that creates the software that is setting rent prices. And I mentioned ProPublica earlier as the source that uncovered the Facebook advertising discrimination. And so I worry a little bit because I know that journalism is getting harder and harder every day, and in many cases is being replaced by artificial intelligence. And I'm curious if you have ideas about, other than waiting for the next ProPublica report, how can we as a community find out, what's harming people?
Well, this is the problem, right? This is why, it's really important for us to all be advocating for transparency. We've been working on trying to establish a statewide rental registry in California since 2017. It was one of the first bills that we worked on. We got our we lost very badly 4 times in a row trying to do this work in Sacramento. So we decided to kind of retrench and look at, how we could try to create this transparency at the city level. Thankfully, a lot of cities do have rental registries. San Francisco's is pretty good. So we'd love to see there be more energy among advocates to sort of push the city to do more with that data, to collect more of it, to make it more robust, to make it more publicly available so that we can build on it. Those things are really important. And then, of course, the legislation that will force companies to be more transparent about how the tools are developed. One thing all of you all can do right now is we are lucky to live in California where there is a pretty strong privacy law where you can request your data from companies and see how they've been using it. So you can we will help you do this, submit data to tenant screening companies, or if you represent renters who would like to participate in this research, submit a request for their data, and we can see how these tools have been used on them. That will really help us understand and uncover patterns. Right now, we don't have enough data to infer how the tools actually work, but we could get there. So that would be super helpful, and that will help us. It isn't enough to create the transparency we need, but it is enough to make the case that we need legislation that forces these companies to be more transparent about how their systems operate.
So next, we'll get to some audience questions in just a couple of minutes, but I want to ask about how people can get involved in making a difference. And this is sort of a 2-part question. The first part being, regular people who are not tech CEOs and maybe not even tech savvy, how can they get involved?
Well, core to our theory of change is that the policy has to be informed by people who are affected by it. So on our labor side, we work with workers to uncover how tools are being used in the workplace or how labor practices are exploiting workers. On the renter side, it's a little harder. Actually, it's a lot harder because, as I said, on the labor side, by and large, workers know when the technology is in use. In the housing sphere, especially with tenant screening tools, like I said, people just don't even know these tools are in place. And so, kind of organizing affected people is very difficult. But it is something that's really important to us, and we want, as I said, to have those voices and those experiences that inform the policy. And so one thing that anybody who's a renter can do, or anybody who works with renters can do, is get them in touch with us, and we can, like I said, help them request their data. We do interviews. We have, strict privacy and safety protocols, so nobody's data will be violated. We will not use anybody's name if they don't want to. This is all completely anonymous if they want it to be, and privacy protecting, but it really is helpful for us to be doing this in a way that is informed by the lived experiences of people on the ground. And we can't really make smart policy otherwise. And honestly, when we go in to talk to legislators, they don't want to hear from us. They want to hear from their constituents. They want to hear from people who are affected by the tools. And so we can't really push very far without having that community with us. So that's the big call to action, I think. And we have a lot more power than we think we do. You frame this as, what if you're not a tech CEO? And that's the thing that I feel holds a lot of people back, is this sort of intimidation with technology. And like I said, you are all experts in this. You see how it is affecting people on the ground. And to sit it out because you're not a technologist is really robbing yourself of agency to change the way that these tools come in and affect our communities. So I just really hope we can get beyond that sense that technology is something that we should be afraid of.
Thanks. So the second part of that question is,
sorry, I went well.
that's okay, is about the tech leaders, the tech companies. From the perspective of a civil rights enforcement agency, our experience has been that when we call them out about an issue of algorithmic bias or outcomes that are disproportionately impacting people of color or women or other groups, their response is often to lawyer up. They're worried about getting sued, and they don't really want to engage with us. So I'm curious, from your role, if you're getting good buy-in and engagement, good collaboration from tech companies? Are there some that are doing better than others at scrutinizing their own work and thinking about how to make it better?
It's funny, I get asked this question. I don't know what it is about people wanting there to be good guy tech companies out there. I didn't expect to get it here. So it's just interesting that even in this space where we're sort of recognizing people power, there's still this question about whether they're good corporate actors. I mean, the answer is it doesn't really matter. And this is, I don't mean to sort of question the premise of the question, but the truth is that even if there were good actors, they're all operating within a context where they have competitors. And if their competitors are not doing the good thing, then it's not sustainable for them to continue to take the high road. I mean, that's just business, right? So, I think it's really important for us not to get caught up in this frame of the way that question gets framed to me a lot is are there voluntary ways in which companies can, be better? And sure, but that's, if they're good companies, they're kind of putting a target on their back by doing something their competitor is not willing to do. So our approach has really been to create the conditions on the ground, both from raising awareness about these issues so that there's public pressure on them, but also changing the regulatory frameworks around what they do so that they are all forced to play by the same rules. Having said that, in the housing space, we found in our tenant screening tool that like Zillow was actually doing pretty okay on these things, and they have been willing to have conversations about this. So that was heartening. And there are other smaller companies that are taking more responsible actions. Like they will provide, if they do a screening for a landlord, they will provide the report to the tenant as well, and like allow that tenant to take the report to other applications instead of having to repeat the application process elsewhere. So, and those are things that like the HUD guidance have asked for. So there are companies who are doing that stuff, but it will require sort of an industry-wide change in order to make a significant difference.
Thank you. So I want to make sure that we have an opportunity for the audience to ask questions. And so if anybody has questions for Catherine, please feel free to raise a hand or come on up. And if you, maybe just to facilitate this, if you just let us know your question, I'll try to repeat it to make sure everybody can hear.
Yeah, so I do have a question. So earlier we was just talking about the history of the discrimination and et cetera, et cetera. And so as you know, with the Web 1, the Web 2, and now we're on Web 3 to 4, right, with artificial intelligence. And I feel like everything is basically going to repeat itself. And so I noticed that you said that you are working with the laborers, right, and you are working with housing. And so, and we also touched on the topic that a lot of us don't see a lot of the ads, right? We can go on Zillow and Rent.com. So my question is, are you working with more so, because for example, are you working more so of diversity with the tech industry, right? So that way there won't be any bias in for us to see the ads, or it won't be any bias to where we won't see the different type of apartments, etc. Because with the Web 1, because I'm in the tech industry as well, and I used to work with Mark as well, being a recruiter, and I've noticed that it's only 2% of Black people in tech, and it's going to be a repeating cycle as well with the machine learning and artificial intelligence. So I'm asking you is, are you connecting with, Black software engineers so that way it won't be any type of bias, right, in the future of your organization, so that way we will see the ads, so that way we will see apartments, right? And also, are you working with lived experience advocates with the software engineers, and so that way they can get the appropriate data, right? Not just the software engineers working with the stockholders or the business, the stockholders or the business, right? More so of the lived experience agencies, lived experience, right? So that way, whenever the software engineers are coding, it will go into the production correctly. Yeah. So I'm asking you, are you working more so of diversifying the talent in tech with the Web 4? So that way, whenever they are producing the code into production, it won't be any type of bias.
Yeah. So the answer is, that's not work. We don't work on diversity in the tech industry per se, but we do know that when there are more diverse voices at the decision-making table, these things are more likely to be spotted. You asked earlier about whether this was like people who are racist who are writing. It's more often that they just don't know, and they don't have that perspective, and so they're only reflecting the lived experience that they have, or and if those voices are not at the table, then they're more likely to make errors. And we've worked with the National Fair Housing Alliance, who also has some tech equity programs, and they have also found that like the best way, not the only way, and it's not like a guarantee that if you have a diverse team working on something, that bias isn't going to end up in the tools. But they have found that when the tech teams at these companies are more diverse and or just have more understand, like you'd be surprised how many people work at housing tech companies don't know what redlining is, Yeah. So just have like an exposure to the fact that these things could be an issue, so they know to raise their hand in a meeting and ask the question is actually pretty powerful. So that is actually we have a sort of ethical standard for companies, and one of the platforms or planks of that platform is diverse voices, or at least a broader understanding of the housing system should be a requirement for all employees at the company.
And also, I want to know, do you know any particular tools that software engineers are particular Black like me, so that way I can be able to trust that system and know that the results are accurate as well? Because I know from my own, experience, there's only 2% of diverse individuals, and so I know when it goes into the production, those results are not accurate. So I want to know if you are going above and beyond and being that leader and putting more transparency into the production.
Well, that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to mandate that the companies have to be more transparent and that they audit their tools. Not necessarily for what goes in, though some of that is part of it. It's more about what comes out, right? And what are the impacts of the decisions that these tools are having? And then how do you reverse engineer some of those bad outcomes out of the systems?
I just want to highlight an example that relates to the importance of diversity in the tech companies. There was a report about Amazon a few years back had developed an AI tool for its own hiring process. And the tool was using information from existing Amazon employees who were good employees, successful programmers. And because of all of the historical, biases that fed into their lives, a lot of those were men. And so the tool was fed data that was mostly about men, and then the tool, unsurprisingly, was choosing men over women based on their interests.
Correct. So I just wanted to know what organization is going above and beyond and using diverse software engineers, and so that way the production, and so that way the tech company can be transparent, and so that way the app can be real too as well. So that's only my question. My whole thing is diversity in tech and all. And
we had a few other hands up.
So you mentioned early on in your talk that one of the things that the folks who produce these tools create this mythology on how complicated it is, you can't possibly understand this. And one theme that I've heard is that the tools themselves, the way that they work, is so complicated that even the engineers themselves don't know what goes into them. So we can't really kind of get inside this black box and regulate how they work, because they're doing all this overcomplicated stuff. Is that the kind of myth you're talking about, or is there something to that where we can't kind of get under the hood? I heard you use that metaphor earlier too. Can you maybe unpack that a little bit?
It is true that often for generative AI, the engineers don't know why the systems produce certain answers, right? I don't know if you played with these tools, if you play with them long enough, they'll sort of start hallucinating or whatever, and it's not always clear why or how, and it's true that the engineers don't always know either. That's sort of the purpose of the tool. They're supposed to be generative, and they're making connections in ways that we wouldn't necessarily be scrutable. But I mean, there are ways, and there are new. Anthropic is doing a lot of work in this arena. They're an OpenAI and Google competitor. They have done a lot to sort of open the hood, and they aren't, they don't have a full understanding of what's going on internally, but they are committing a lot of resources to better understanding. And so it is possible, and I think we will get to a point where there's at least some, sense of what's going on in the brains of these. I hate to personalize these things too much, but what's going on that are, how the tools are drawing the connections that they're drawing. For automated decision-making systems, I think it's a lot simpler. It's not always clear. It's maybe harder to uncover, but it's not impossible. And also for those tools, it's a little bit more we're more concerned about the outputs than the decision-making process itself. So there are ways to understand, to infer some things about what's going on within the system based on the outputs. And you can change the inputs and see if you get different outputs, and, so it's less magical, I guess I'll say.
I have a question. Time for one or two more questions. Please. Thank you. Yes, that's a very mature, sensitive question and statement, and it's regards to
AI and housing both, and it kind of is a legal borderline opportunity question. I'm a cybersecurity graduate, and I'm also going back to school for computer science. I've been going to school since 19. I'm 37. I'll be 38 next week. In regards to court cases involving housing, there's been cases, like I've even done this myself. I hate to use this term, social engineering, but it was to fix my situation because I felt like human decision wasn't going to effectively assert themselves the proper way. And it's like, to change somebody's mind, you kind of have to change the situation to get them to act the way they should. What is the legal severity of, even if it's in the name of peace, of a cyber attack in regards to it being for a good reason when it comes to court? Would you happen to know any of that?
Well, any lawyers in the room?
I'm not. That would be in my favor, actually.
I'm not sure we have anyone really prepared to answer that question.
Thanks for not being 50 fans.
And I think we have one more question here.
I wanted to ask about discrimination AI with mortgage companies. What have you seen or heard, or and besides, what we know about redlining and all that, but mortgage companies, what tools are they utilizing based upon submitted information? Because when we went into the COVID and everything went digital, now everything is digital, and you're doing all your applications and such.
So the question's about AI discrimination by mortgage companies specifically.
Lending companies, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of those areas where there are actually some transparency requirements. So mortgage lenders have to report data about their lending outcomes, right? And this is how we know when these banks, like it came out, I want to say last year or the year before, that Wells Fargo was like disproportionately rejecting mortgage applications for Black buyers. And that's the kind of information. So now Wells Fargo, there is the information available to hold them accountable in the public sphere, but also regulators have that information. And it's a lot harder for the company. They're going to put a lot more effort into making sure their tools are not discriminatory. We don't have that kind of information for the rental market. And that's exactly why I think we need broader public rental databases, that landlords should have to report the price that they're charging for a unit every year. So we can not just discern patterns, which is really helpful, but also so we can enforce the laws that are already on the books. And we have a statewide rent cap. It's a bill that we co-sponsored in 2019, which was the largest expansion of tenant protections in American history when it passed. And we have no ability really to enforce that law. So what does it really mean if we can't see what's going on in the rental market? Regulators will say, well, we do have that data, companies publish some data, there are proprietary data sets, but that's exactly the type of information that I'm talking about the public or the private sector using against us. They have the capacity and the resources to use those tools. We do not. And so that's why it's really incumbent on housing advocates to really make it clear that having a public option for rental market data is not a wonky kind of, this is so we can crunch numbers and write white papers. It's so that we can enforce the laws on the books and we can hold landlords accountable, housing providers accountable to the standards that they are supposed to be following.
That's all the time we have. So Catherine Bracey, thank you so much for being here.